Dear friends of Books and Voices of Revelation, welcome to the narration of the following audiobook, The Silence of Adam, by Larry Crabb. Introduction. This book was written by three men who are growing but struggling, men who openly confess that the struggles seem to deepen as life progresses. Our lives are simply not right as Christian culture seems to think they should be. Christian men, especially those in leadership positions, are expected to be constantly encouraged, passionate about their vision, and have very few problems. Mature men should not struggle with crazy thoughts, sinful impulses, or feelings of despair. However, we believe that they have difficulties. Our concept of spiritual masculinity is more related to someone who continues to function despite difficulties, rather than victory over them. We believe that the Spirit of God is less interested in telling us how to make our lives work and more interested in awakening, in the midst of incessant difficulties, our passion for Christ. Instead of solving our problems, He more often uses them to throw us off balance, to make us less sure of how life unfolds, to lead us to ask the difficult questions we are terrified to ask, to bring to the surface stubborn doubts and the unpleasant demands that keep us away from Christ. We do not believe that the Bible presents a plan for making life work, as many believe it should. We believe it offers a reason to keep going even when life isn't going so well. If we could find formulas that really worked, formulas for overcoming anger, having godly children, or feeling closer to our wives, we would follow them. But we don't believe they exist. In our way of thinking, real men admit their fear of confusion, but they don't run away from it to trust easily or adopt a many-step plan. We are more attracted to the mystery of life than its predictability. Not because we especially enjoy feeling confused and out of control. It's hard to feel these things. Sometimes we hate it. But we don't think we have another option. No, if we face life honestly. Some parts of life, of course, are ordered and controllable. Cars don't run without fuel, flossed teeth present fewer problems, families don't function as well without husbands and fathers involved. The things that can be done must be done. To the extent that life can be controlled, it must be controlled well. But the most important parts of life, those that make up everything Christianity is supposed to be, seem to us more mysterious than controllable, more chaotic than orderly. What do you do when you discover that a babysitter sexually abused your daughter? How do you deal with the relentless jealousy you have of a friend who earns more than you? What can you do with a life of immoral fantasies that just won't go away? How do you approach God when everything inside you feels dead? How does the Spirit of God lead us to the Father's house, where the party takes place? There is simply no formula to follow when it comes to the things that matter most to us. And we believe that God planned it to be this way, not to frustrate or discourage us, but to evoke from within us something that He has already placed in us, something that is released only when we surrender to Him in the midst of the mystery. Spiritual masculinity involves the courage to keep moving forward, in the midst of overwhelming confusion, towards relationships. This relationship is all about understanding exactly how it works and then doing it. We write this book as three men who live stories. Unfinished. We struggle with questions that no one answers. We fail in the face of things that, at this point, we thought we had already overcome. We fight unpleasant desires within us, including the urge to give up when life makes us feel weak. We strive to live together in community with others. But still, we have hope. Perhaps our lives are moving toward a kind of maturity that will leave us speechless and Satan speechless. We hope that even though we are confused, sometimes discouraged, and sometimes desperate, we are still moving forward toward our wives, our children, our friends, and our God. We don't always move fluidly and sometimes we stop. But never as a permanent adjustment. This is our central message. Masculinity means moving. Not always in success, not even in victories, but moving, with the kind of movement that only a passionate, absorbing, spirit-directed fascination can produce. And that is the real victory. Allow us to introduce ourselves. We are three men, each with a story to tell. Stories of sadness, joy, failure, success, boredom, passion, revenge and love. Come with us as we consider what it means to be a man and live as God intended men to live. The story begins. Larry Crabb. The boy in the front row with the mischievous smile, the one on the far left, is me, 4 years old. It's a strange feeling to look at myself 50 years later and wonder what's behind that exhibitionist smile. My mind wanders away from this portrait and wanders in different directions. I remember when I was about 30 years old. I had just led a Bible study in Phil and Evelyn's living room. During the celebration that followed, I took a piece of Evelyn's cake and walked around. I can see myself joking, teasing, entertaining, stopping each of the people I had just taught with what my memory says was a boisterous smile, not unlike the one in the portrait. After everyone left except me and my wife, Evelyn looked at me with a familiar look, a worried look. "I think I know why you act like a clown sometimes," she said. I immediately felt trapped, even a little irritated, but I managed to appear indifferent. Why? Because it takes the pressure off of being the man you are. Another memory. Maybe he was about 12 years old. I was on vacation with my parents and brother and spent the night in a small, rustic hotel in the mountains in upstate New York, just outside a small, quiet town called Shroon Lake. My bed was the top bunk. A window opened onto the lake, bathed in moonlight and framed by 1,000 pine trees. I remember lying in my bunk, looking out the window, completely captivated by the majesty of the scene. An overwhelming feeling that I was part of something great, something beautiful, crept into my consciousness. In my entire life, this was perhaps the closest thing to a call from God that I had ever heard. I knew I fit in. I knew I was part of a bigger story and I felt awakened. I had something to give that would make a difference. I got very excited. I felt elevated to a dimension I had never seen before. But I also felt scared, terrified by a fear that wanted to paralyze me. Now another episode comes to mind. I grew up in Plymouth Meeting, a small neighborhood in the Philadelphia suburbs, and my room was at the end of a long hallway. One night I was lying in bed reading my Bible. Maybe he was 13 years old. I heard my father's footsteps approaching my room. I quickly hid the Bible under the covers and grabbed a comic. Dad would have loved to see me reading the Bible. But why did I deny him this joy? Why did I prefer to be seen with a comic? If you ask my mother what I was like as a child, she will surely answer you immediately, as she has done many times, and with a look of affectionate exasperation. I was naughty. From my childhood until I graduated from high school and college, I worked hard to be dumb. No one who knew me during those years ever guessed that I felt called by God and that I read the Bible. The fact that I write serious books instead of comics has surprised most of my childhood and teenage friends. Have I been trying for years, since kindergarten, to hide my essence behind nonsense? Did I joke with our Bible study friends to avoid being taken too seriously? Was I terrified by the idea of having something to say to this world? Would I be a scoundrel, trying to escape a call, felt from a very early age, to be a man, seeking to deny the dreams that were forming within me? Maybe I'm still a scoundrel. I'm still smiling as I sit in the front row of my community. I wonder if the prospect of entering my world, as the person I know myself to be, still terrifies me. Perhaps it angers me and makes me feel isolated, disconnected, alone. These thoughts run through my head as I look at the smiling 4-year-old I was, and maybe still am. As I continue to look at the photo, a whole sequence of thoughts occurs to me. I don't remember, but I can't imagine that the Sunday school teacher was especially pleased with my mischievous smile. If I close my eyes and visualize what I assume was his disapproving look, I can feel a strange pleasure, a clear feeling of satisfaction. I never felt part of my group of friends. I never bowed easily to the rules. Maybe I like it that way. A little rebellion is nice. Maybe there is a good kind of rebellion, a pride, a courage to live authentically, even if the price doesn't fit. Maybe it's the courage to dream. Whatever it is, I like it. A little honest reflection makes me think that I am an iconoclast, a nonconformist, a radical with short hair and a navy blue sneaker. A seminary hired me as a professor for 7 years and then asked me to leave. My presence did not sit well with some of his clients. In retrospect, I can see hundreds of things I said and did that would understandably worry you. Many of these things were immature, some sinful, others, I would do it again. I feel that releasing the person I am is a dangerous business. Maybe I'm a rebellious rogue with a mischievous smile on my face, more often than I think. But neither rebellion nor deception define me. There is something else that is more central to my being. I am a masculine reflection of the character of God. I was designed to move in, and through, my world with laughter and hope. I am called to care less about conformity than integrity, less about fitting in and more about the visions of a dreamer. The lightness of laughter is sort of the hope and the courage to remain alone, while dreaming. These are the marks of a man. Clowning around is a cheap laugh. Clowns make faces. The men laugh. Rebellion is corrupt integrity. The rebels destroy. Men give life. I don't want to be either a clown or a rebel, but I don't want to avoid these two mistakes so strictly that I lose the good qualities they disguise. I don't want to be a predictable conformist, trapped in something that requires less of me than I am called to give. I don't want a fantasy life that I can enjoy without leaving the couch. I want dreams that make me move forward in the face of impossible adversities. I want to have hope, when life is intolerable and breaks what makes it intolerable. Perhaps the exhibitionist smile of the rebellious scoundrel matures one day into the laughter of a romantic and the courage of a dreamer. A framed black and white photograph of a young baseball player sits on a dresser in our bedroom, among other family mementos. The famous pose with a striped uniform, cap on his head and club on his shoulder, I imagine, will be seen by my grandchildren one day in the distant future. I wonder how they will look at me. Will they look at the photo with the same disinterested look that I usually have when I look through old family albums? Will they laugh at the old-fashioned uniform and the ears that stick out of an oversized cap? They may laugh, but I hope they do something different. I want you to know something else. My hope is that you understand that this photo is nothing more than a frame from a film and cannot be understood outside of the context of the entire film. I want you to make assumptions about that boy. What was he like? What were your qualities, your weaknesses, your dreams? I'm not entirely sure how I'll convey that sense of the story. But I am sure that before I convey something, I have to know it myself. In a way, I need to be deeply interested in that photograph before I ask someone to reflect on it. I want to understand the scenes from my past in a broader context, and then see how I clearly remember the persistent emptiness of our home, how much I missed my father and how much I longed for his presence with us. I dreamed that one day I would return. I also feared for my mother's well-being. The first 2 weeks of school, in first grade, I slipped out of class without anyone seeing me and ran home worried about my mother. While the rest of my friends were at school, working hard on the alphabet, I worried about how we were going to survive. The 6-year-old boy became a little man. I was caught between the need to be a man for my mother and the loneliness of being a fatherless boy. I wasn't a man, nor did I feel like that, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that, as a child, my world collapsed at my feet and I was faced with terrifying chaos. My circumstances forced me to invent some way to cope with my terror, confusion and sadness. But how could I face all this if there was nothing behind me? How could he be a man, when in reality he was a little boy? I became convinced that being a man was impossible, something like trying to draw fresh water from an empty well. Thus, the imposter began his journey. This is how I lived as a child, and this is how I chose to reach adulthood. Most men approach marriage, children, vocation, and finances with great ease. I faced these things with paralyzing fear. For example, Marriage was a torturous decision that I flirted with for years. I would date someone for a few months or even years, and, as the prospect of marriage seemed closer and closer, it would suddenly, miraculously, evoke godlike doubts. And they were pressing doubts. They included questions about how I could live in a caravan, depending solely on a shepherd's salary, or conjectures, after a few months of dating, about what had happened to the magic that existed between us before. My dating pattern was so predictable it was terrifying. The closer someone got to my heart, the more furiously the doubts arose and the faster I ran. He was running at full speed. From what? He didn't know, but he was fleeing. I always apologized and explained to people easily that it was just my personality. Look, I'm a free and easygoing guy. But he couldn't escape the suspicion that he was running away from the things he wanted most. Although I was terrified, I knew I desperately wanted to love and be loved. I passionately wanted to share my life with someone special, someone who would walk the journey with me. I loved children, but I never believed I could be a father. To compensate for my fear and feelings of inadequacy, I followed the pattern I learned as a child. I discovered a way to feel like a man. By the time I was 28, I had already realized many of my vocational dreams. I was competent and successful in my ministry. I threw myself into work with a terrible fury. I lived to compete and win, and I openly challenged people to tell me I couldn't do any work. Each time he proved them wrong. The same portrait, just a little older, nice suit, nice smile, successful posture. But there was something terribly wrong. I was successful, but empty. The more I excelled at work and in my education, the more I felt like I excelled in unimportant things. I crawled through the labyrinth that society places before its men and came to a dead end. Much worse, it was a dead end. Secretly, he lived by this motto: in my world I don't have what it takes to be a man. I spent all my energy convincing everyone that I was worthy because I was competent. My well was empty and I was trying to fill it with things that came from outside of me, things that weren't really important. It costs $1 million to live and love, and only a few cents jingled in my pocket. However, if it ended here, my story would be another tragedy. In this book we give great importance to stories. One of the main reasons for this is our conviction that we are a generation of men without stories. We are a generation of men who do not know who we are, why we are here or where we are going. We are all on this journey called manhood, but few of us, if we are honest, are comfortable on the path we are on. Since I didn't have the privilege of growing up with my father, I didn't think I had any story to back me up, any story to carry forward. I felt like there was no one for me, so I had to fend for myself. The absence of history in my life forced me to return to the admirable story of my father, the only one who was always present. And I discovered that I do have a story to tell. A rich and varied story emerged from my loss. Now I can see a little more clearly that my story is about the redemptive and disabling touch of a father. It is a story that gave courage to a terrified man, confidence to an insecure man, and hope to a discouraged man. If we sat down for coffee and you saw me today, you would see a really strange portrait. Every now and then you would see some guy fooling you with a suit and a smile. You would also observe a child who fears and chuckles. But most of the time you would see a lion. Not a child, who has changed dramatically. You would talk to a man who loves his wife and is completely delighted with his son. I would see a man who has some close friends and who is no longer alienating his father, whom he loves. I used to think that being a man was jumping out of bed every morning with a perfect story. No fear, no tragedy, no insecurity, no doubt. But now I believe that being a man in this world means being someone who has the courage to overcome your fear, the faith to answer your doubts, and the love to carry you beyond the loss. Hope, for me, lies in my potential to touch people in redemptive ways, for generations to come, rather than simply passing by them like a tortured ghost. God made man because he loved stories. Audiovisual, The Portals of the Forest. About Donald Hudson. I have felt like an imposter my entire life. That's why I wear a nice suit. I assume the posture of a successful person. I put a smile on my face. I give the impression of having it all. I am the image of success. But don't be fooled by the photography in this book. There is another portrait that I never show to anyone. If you saw me the way I see myself, you would see a different person. You would see a man who feels insecure and incompetent, a man who loses hours of sleep at night because he is worried about succeeding. We would see a man who believes that he has nothing and therefore needs to pretend that he has something, anything, to offer. You would see a man wondering if there is something under that nice suit. The boy in the suit. An excellent portrait of my life as a man. On the outside I pretend I have it all while on the inside I fall apart. I was 6 years old when this photograph was taken, shortly after my parents separated. When I entered first grade, I wanted to identify with my father so badly that I changed my name to my father's. Incredible, a 6-year-old boy changing his name. But that's what I did. From that day on he would no longer be Michael Hudson, but Donald Hudson. They fit into a bigger picture, the movie that was playing long before I was born and that will continue forever. That's why I want to be part of this book. Because I want to think about my own story in a way that makes a difference to those with whom I have a relationship, my wife, my family, my friends, and my colleagues. I want to think about my story not in an absorbed way, but in a way that leads to change. The photograph on the dresser is a reflection of what I want to say. It's a photo of me, 8 years old, dressed and ready for the game. This is what you can see. What you can't see is a kid who wasn't good at team sports. And what you also can't see, what for years even I couldn't see, are the deep commitments in the heart of that child player to a particular way of life. But let me explain. I will never forget my first time as a hitter. After several shifts and months of anticipation, I found myself where I had dreamed of being one day. I would fight back. The pitcher that day was one of the oldest 8-year-olds in the class, in those days, an intimidating figure. On the first pitch I vibrated the bat hard and nothing. First lost. The second pitch, questionably not on base, but deemed good by the judge, lost. The third pitch was too far left, ball out. On the fourth pitch, I swung the bat hard and nothing, 3 missed. Actually, I don't remember my failure as a terribly unusual or difficult experience. Getting eliminated was a very common thing among the players on my team. However, as the weeks went by and I continued to be eliminated, I do remember that a strange feeling began to overcome me. A lot of the other guys on the team were starting to do well. And with the hits came applause, shouts and jubilant runs around the bases. While they were enjoying the game, I still hadn't made the connection between a ball and a bat. Little by little my enthusiasm for the game. It gave rise to shame and painful effort. I started to get the impression that the season might be quite long, at least for me. And that's when I noticed something. Some players managed to reach base without allowing a single hit. It was the batters who received more outs from the pitchers than the errors they themselves made, and in this case they were allowed to walk to first base. From time to time they even had the joy of being applauded as they walked around the bases on their way to the batter's box, the result of having a good hitter chasing them in the lineup. Being eliminated became increasingly humiliating, so I made a decision, although I don't remember it being a conscious decision. Since young pitchers were not known for their accuracy of aim, I realized that there was a good chance that a good number of the balls thrown my way would not make it over the plate. If I didn't swing the bat, at least I would have a chance to reach base and put an end to that horrible feeling that came over me after I struck out. For the rest of the season, I never hit again. Pitch after pitch, the bat landed on my shoulder. And although I was eliminated more times than I expected, from time to time I got hit. From time to time he reached the batter's base. The story is a sadly apt metaphor for the way I have chosen to live much of my life. For many years, even as an adult, I was firmly committed to not swinging the club because it was too painful. When a man swings his bat and does not hit the ball, he experiences failure and humiliation. Incompetence is exposed and shame is a byproduct of this. Even if you spin and hit, you feel the pressure of expectations. After all, if you do it right once, you should be able to do it again. It's easier to leave the bat on your shoulder and expect an occasional walk, depending on the pitcher's failure and the success of the next batter. The thrill arching your body backwards, backing up with all your might and throwing a ball over the fence is, for many men, unthinkable. This was the portrait of my life, a man immobile, afraid to move, refusing to move, wanting to move, held back by a prior commitment to security, whether in vocation, relationships, or the responsibilities of daily life. Any observable successes achieved were attributed to others and, internally, viewed with suspicion. As I write these words, I feel a sense of sadness and joy. Sadness, for the damage my lack of movement caused to others. Sadness also at being separated from God's purposes for me as a man for so long. Remorse, 4 years spent in a chosen and apparently necessary helplessness. If this were the end of the story, I would have no reason to write. But I have a pen in my hand and it moves. I got to know the feeling of spinning and hitting, and in the process, what I feared happened. The failure has been more than evident and the pressure, coming from doing it well, has only increased. But the passion, killed by my lack of movement, revived and, with it, came the desire for more. First part. Something seriously is wrong. The dream is lost. Men feel easily threatened. And when a man feels threatened, when he feels discomfort within himself, something he does not understand, he naturally retreats into a realm of comfort or dominates someone or something to feel powerful. Men refuse to feel the paralyzing, humiliating horror of uncertainty, a horror that could force them to trust, a horror that could unleash in them the power to give deeply in relationships. As a result, most men do not feel close to anyone, especially God, and no one feels close to them. Something good in men is blocked and it is necessary to start it. When the good movement stops, the bad movement, retreat or dominance, it certainly develops. Chapter 1. A Vision for Men. He had been married for less than 2 years and things were terrible. He felt lost, confused, angry. The only thing he knew for sure was that he wanted to talk to his father. More than anything, he wanted his father to understand him, to be there with him, to look at him with kindness, involvement and respect, without lecturing him or turning away. His father had always been his hero, the model of all that was good. Happily married for 34 years to his faithful mother, a woman who never complained, who always stayed at home. He remembered hearing her express her interest in working at a nearby children's hospital. She really liked children, but her father always discouraged her from such an attempt with a smile and a gentle disapproving reminder that he would support the family. Also in the church his father was a wonderful example. As a priest he served the elements in the monthly celebration of Holy Communion. He had struggled to maintain the weekday prayer service and Bible study when the new assistant pastor suggested replacing it with family groups. He never drank, everyone knew. Gave tithes faithfully, had family devotions almost every night, kept 3 children under control at all times. Your family is a good testimony was a phrase he had heard many times addressed to his father, who always smiled and gave glory to God. Why is it a 20-minute drive to Dad's house? Did it seem so long to you? Why that terrible tightness in the chest? Dad began. I need to talk to you. Everything is horrible in my marriage. I don't know what to do. The smile. That same smile that kept his mother inside the house for 34 years. The same as others thought he was humble. Then she realized, for the first time, how much she hated him. Then the father spoke. He indicated 2 book titles, followed by advice to read Ephesians 5, and the suggestion that he give everything to the Lord. But Dad, He almost exploded. I read these books. I studied Ephesians 5, and I prayed the best I know how. I want something more from you. The father remained motionless. The smile disappeared, replaced by a look that could kill, a look his son had seen before, but had never directed at him. Silence. A terrifying moment of tension. Then the father stood up and, without saying a word, left the room. That was the first time. He later admitted that I realized that my father was weak. I wonder what it would be like to see a man totally devoted to the Lord. On the wall next to my office desk hang the words of D.L. Moody, written, framed and placed so that I can see them every day. The world has yet to see what God can do with, for, through, in and for the man who is totally and completely consecrated to Him. I will do everything I can to be that man. I love reading biographies, stories of men like Oswald Chambers, C.S. Lewis, John Knox, Jonathan Edwards, Augustine, Paul and Jeremiah. Reading about their lives, I get the impression that our modern ideas about male maturity are far removed from what godly men of generations before us understood and practiced. Today we talk a lot about things like vulnerability and having the courage to feel our pain. They seemed more interested in worshipping and witnessing. We talk about communication and living up to our potential. They fell to their knees broken and rose to serve. I wonder if the virtues we are trying to develop were natural to those men all those years ago, whose toughest battles were fought against everything that prevented them from knowing Christ. We meet in small groups to share our feelings and discuss principles for relating more closely or developing self-esteem. They took long walks with older men who spoke easily about God and who launched into prayer without warning. On one occasion, during his dark night of the soul, which lasted several years, Oswald Chambers went rabbit hunting with John Cameron, an old friend from Scotland, accompanied by 2 dogs. The purpose of the walk was to hunt, but when they reached a grassy bank, Cameron suggested they stop for a while and pray. We knelt and he led us in prayer, Chambers wrote of the occasion. Then I began to pray, but the collie puppy, who had been perfectly calm during the old man's prayer, thought I had nothing to do but play with him and began to run, jump on me and lick my face. And shouting with joy. Cameron stood up, grabbed the puppy sternly by the neck and said, "Quiet, quiet. I'll sit on the dog while you pray." And that's what he did. Religious men today have too often found a convenient God, a God of immediate usefulness, promoted by leaders who are more vibrant. Multitudes of fanatics who for the opportunity of quiet communion with God. The most enduring sin in Israel's history was committed by King Jeroboam. 1 Kings 12, especially verses 26 and 33, who facilitated the worship of the people by reducing God to a local, visible deity, and he did so simply to further his own ambitions. And it worked. He gained a large following and reigned in Israel for 22 years. Great crowds can produce great things. But they scare me. God's deepest and most lasting work is often done in isolation, in person-to-person dialogue or small group discussions. Sometimes his best work begins among the great crowds, but what happens there can easily be taken as something finished, when it is nothing more than something begun. Large crowds help modern men feel like men. Whether we are rooting for our football team or cheering in the name of Jesus, we face our emptiness by filling it with whatever emotion we can find. Large gatherings inflame us with what appears to be authentic masculinity. Men of previous generations engaged in intense personal battles that lasted for years, battles that subsided only when they gave themselves more fully to Christ, not only when they felt a new passion overcome them at a large gathering or when they discovered something new about themselves in the church. Therapy. The joy of finding Christ was released through brokenness over sin, leading to a reverent surrender to God. The knowledge of Christ intimately developed through a profound work of the Spirit of God that sometimes occurred in large crowds but, more frequently, during long periods of anguished prayer in solitude. It can be argued that men today tend to be more sensitive when it comes to relationships than our stern ancestors. Perhaps we are more aware that we must connect with our wives, children and friends. Perhaps we are learning that real men are both tender and strong, in ways that older men never clearly understood. The modern counseling movement can take much of the credit for this good effect. But whatever achievements we have made in modern society, they have been largely futile because most of us have lost the depth of connection with Christ that only comes through inexplicable suffering, poignant brokenness, and repentance so deep. This book is a call to return to the old ways, not to give up the good lessons that modern Christian thought has taught us, but to refocus much more on how to find ourselves as we lose ourselves in Christ. I want to see us let go of our efforts to solve our problems, heal our pain, and regain our self-esteem. I want to clear the stage so that Christ is brought into the spotlight. I want to fix our attention so completely on His beauty and power that all other thoughts are perfumed with His fragrance. Worship Christ, pray to Him, seek Him eagerly throughout the Scriptures, humble ourselves before Him in brokenness for our pride and lukewarm devotion, wait on Him to fill us with His Spirit, serve Him with sincere purpose and consuming passion. To all the others. These are the ancient paths to which we must return. As you read this book, don't lose sight of this simple truth: the only way to be manly is to first be godly. In our days, men seek their masculinity more than God. Too many men are making the mistake of studying masculinity and trying to practice what they learn without paying enough attention to their relationship with God. Do we really love Christ, or is our passion more programmed and wavering than genuine and constant? Are we growing in a holiness that attracts others, primarily our families, to Christ, or do we exhibit a fervor and practice a ritualism that only impresses others with our zeal? Ron was part of a men's group from his church that met early in the morning every week. They talked about their battles with lust, tensions at home, and worries at work. They prayed and sang together, hugged and sometimes cried together, telling each other what was happening in their lives. Ron always left these meetings excited and ready, like a man, to conquer his world. He couldn't have been more surprised when one day his wife asked him to stop attending the group. He didn't like the effect the group was having on him. She felt that he came out of there more excited than tender, more determined to do the right thing than to get involved with his family and friends. Our best efforts to become manly will never produce authentic masculinity until an abiding sense of adoration grows in our hearts. And if we think that encountering Christ is something we can do in a weekend seminar, then our worship will be superficial. Finding Christ is a long struggle to annihilate pride that passes through despair and reaches the uncontrollable joy of the fullness of the Spirit, passing again through darker despair to an even more radiant joy. Men who avoid this combat will only experience superficial regret. Your true commitment will be to things that don't really matter. You will never develop a passion that can touch another person's core with life-giving love. Ron ended up leaving the group. He began meeting for breakfast with an older man from church whom he had noticed for years but never met. Ron had heard him pray a couple of times in church. His prayers were different. They felt like intimate conversations with a dear friend. For almost 4 months, Ronnie met this man, sometimes every day of the same week. He asked her to tell him about her life, her marriage, her relationship with God. That man always carried his Bible and often opened it with the enthusiasm of a grandfather taking photographs of his first grandchild. When that man could no longer participate in these meetings, Ron's wife was disappointed. Men who learn to be more fascinated by Christ than by themselves will become the authentic men of our day. Men of this generation need to learn to consider the cost of following Christ. The cost is easy to calculate: everything we have. We need to feel the emptiness of our souls until no cost seems too great to contact Him. We need to resist the influence of Christian culture that values self-discovery and self-satisfaction over our total surrender to God. In short, we should be more concerned with knowing Christ than with knowing ourselves. If all this really happens, then 30 years from now more boys will be able to discover, in the older generation, a greater number of examples of godly and manly men. Perhaps they will be led to seek God with all their heart and soul, moved by the powerful coherence and non-threatening love they see in us. I have a dream. Only time will tell if it is really from God. I think so. Actually, my dream is quite simple. As I look 30 years into the future, I see some groups scattered here and there across the Christian landscape in which godly character and spiritual wisdom will be more prestigious than titles and skills, and more valued than achievements and competence. I see a community of people struggling, tormented by all the evils that come with having to live in a world we were never designed to endure, fighting inclinations and impulses we were never meant to feel. I see people whose marriages are terrible, whose children have shattered their hope for a happy family, whose emotions are out of control, who have horrible nights. Long terrified by memories of unspeakable childhood abuse, so hurt by rejection that it feels like their heart was being ripped out of their chest, hating themselves because of the sexually perverted impulses that plague their innermost beings, who are about to give up all hope under the weight of infinite loneliness. In my dream, I see these people doing something that very few do in real life today. I see them pass by the office that has a sign advertising a professional whose training guarantees technical competence but not a godly character. I see them returning books to the shelves of the Christian bookstore, the books whose dust jackets falsely promise for now what only heaven will provide later. I see them taking a brochure promoting the seminar everyone is talking about, looking at it, and then putting it back. I see these people stumbling into a lonely widow's living room, heading to a restaurant to spend a few hours with a weary widower, knocking on the office door where someone humble and longing for heaven is waiting, someone who is uninhibitedly faithful and pointing warmly to Christ. I foresee a generation in which mentors are not so scarce, in which pastors and elders are once again held in high regard because they pastor, in which Christian leaders are no longer required to lead ministries in the same way as executives build corporations, but are instead revered as men of godly influence. If I look closely at my dream, I can see an army of wise men and women distributed among God's people, armed only with delicate discernment and penetrating wisdom, qualities of character that were forged in the flames of suffering. These are the ones who paid a price that few are willing to pay. And they paid it continuously for years without relief. These men are fathers, these women are mothers, godly people whose silent presence is felt and valued. A young couple wrote to me in despair, "We have been married for 6 years and things are not working out. Do you know a good Christian therapist in our area?" Why would this couple write to me, a professional, trained and licensed psychologist, instead of asking an elder from their church to meet with them both? Could it be that they were attracted by my title? For my character? Why do most people who have problems immediately think about seeking professional help? Why don't you look for wise Christian men and women among the wise? Most of us wouldn't consult an elder about panic attacks or sexual struggles, any more than you would ask your pastor to give you a root canal. Because our culture has believed the lie that personal problems are no different in nature from physical problems. In both types of problems, we think there is something wrong that can only be fixed by an expert whose understanding exceeds the wisdom the Bible offers. We have completely lost sight of the fact that any non-physical problem is, in essence, a moral problem that has its roots in a person's relationship with God. Therefore, we have produced a generation of therapists, an army of counselors trained to combat problems they barely understand because they spent more time in classrooms, becoming competent, than in the presence of God becoming elders. We have lost interest in developing mentors, wise men and women who know how to get to the true heart of things and who have the power to bring supernatural resources to combat what is wrong. If my dream comes true, our entire culture will change. Like an earthquake that dramatically changes the landscape, so my dream, if realized, will profoundly alter our most cherished institutions. It will shatter our deepest assumptions about how we should live our lives. Everything that is not material will change. Things that are based on scientific facts and empirically proven procedures. Naturally, it will not be affected. Surgical techniques and engineering projects to build skyscrapers will not be changed by the revolution I dream of, nor will the legitimate use of medications for panic attacks, obsessive-compulsive disorders, and some cases of depression. But the way we do church, The way we influence lives, the way we provide social and moral leadership, the way we live together in families and communities, all of this will be radically altered. Celebrities will go dark. A few sentences from an elder will mean more than all the secrets of effective living shared by an applauded communicator at a weekend seminar. Large Christian events will be limited to evangelism or meaningful prayer, worship passionate or biblical instruction. People will covet a night at a counselor's house more than the opportunity to attend a motivational meeting. They will know that the first has more power to change their lives than the second. Awards banquets in the Christian community will look less like Hollywood events. People will be honored in a way that significantly demeans them rather than elevating them as more significant because of their achievements. No one will compete with Christ for the highest honors. In my dream I see a generation of counselors, wise elders who are valued more than experts trained to help us respond to life's challenges, godly men and women whose power and wisdom reach our souls deeper than knowledge and skill from an expert. For my dream to come true, it will take a miracle from God, not the flashy pseudo-miracle that sparks a movement, but the solid, profound kind that can initiate reform. We have had enough movements, enough events that generate a large following and make headlines. But we haven't had any reform for many years. Maybe the time has come. My dream can be summed up in a phrase as simple as it is profound. If men become men, the world will be transformed. It is also true that if women become women, the world will be transformed. A book could and should be written about a parallel dream, a dream about older women becoming mothers and younger women learning to be sisters. Such a book about godmothers and godsisters would be an appropriate complement to this book about godfathers and godbrothers. In my dream, the older men will be fathers and the younger men will be brothers. When men around the world regain their voice, release their power, and reclaim the joy of following God's call to become authentic men, the very nature of the Christian community will change. That's my dream. But I'm worried. I worry about precisely the things that should calm me down. I'm concerned about the amount of attention this whole topic of masculinity is getting. I worry that whatever good is being developed will be undone in a future setback when the men's movement is exposed like a building on sand. I worry that we are not facing the terrible problems within us that disfigure our masculinity, problems that only prolonged, painful surgery can cure. I worry that we have set our sights too low, that we are pursuing something too easy to achieve, that a deeper love for Christ is not at the center of things. Perhaps we are settling for a counterfeit of true masculinity. Sometimes it seems to me that this idea of becoming a real man has been reduced to a cultural fad, a mere movement accompanied by the usual elements, the enthusiasm of large crowds, the hope of new formulas, the inspiration of orators' challenges, the determination of shouted commitments and the ideas of the gurus on duty. What we don't need is a temporary burst of determination and passion. What we really need is reformation, that work of God marked by repeated cycles of brokenness, repentance, perseverance, and joy. We need God to empower us to enter into the mystery of relationships at a level of life-giving connection that enthusiasm and slogans can never produce. We need to surrender to Christ in a way that releases all that the Spirit has placed within us. We must determine, in detail, the cost of becoming men until the call of anything inferior disappears and only the call of God remains. If we want to become a generation of counselors and have a culture filled with men of character and vision, men who can guide the next generation to true holiness, then we must carefully consider what the men will be like when Christ is formed in them. In a time when Satan's ability to sell us a counterfeit of the truth is at its peak, when we are likely to confuse a comfortably narrow path with one that is even narrower, we must begin with a clear idea of what means. It seems that the miracle of masculinity exists. Chapter 2. Manly Men and Unmanly Men. This time he was in serious trouble. In fact, he had offended important people before, enough to get him into trouble, but nothing had been as complicated as this. His friends wanted to help. They were all young, strong, determined, in the prime of life, eager to pursue what they believed in. They met to discuss what they could do. None of his ideas were of much use. Things had gone too far. And they knew it. The conversation gradually moved from ideas to complaints. They were angry. It just wasn't fair. Policy. It was just what it was. Dirty and rotten politics. Shortly after the meeting, one of them, a burly man with olive skin dry from many days at sea, tried to pick a fight with a sycophant on the other side, thinking it would be very cool to hit someone. Even the ugly names gave some relief. But why didn't he do something? After all, the battle was his, a battle for his life. The people were terrified. All his hopes were dashed. What would they do? What would happen to them if he were taken away from them? That was all they could think about. Suddenly, he called them to a meeting. Excellent. Now we are getting somewhere. He has a plan. He is ready to move, to take charge like a man. But all he said was, things are going to get very difficult. And this is starting to bother me. I want you to stay close. They had seen him troubled before. But not like this. They wanted to stay involved with him. But it was hard to stand there, helpless, just watching. And they had not slept for several days. Why had he not defended himself when they questioned him? He had influential friends. Why didn't you appeal to them? He wasn't doing anything to help himself. He seemed resigned, moreover, willing to endure terrible hardships as if it were his destiny. He stayed very still, very calm. After that time he collapsed. How did he manage to keep a cool head and not scream for justice or revenge? After all that, until the end, he cared more about his friends and his enemies than himself, even though he was the one facing the worst nightmare. Someone who had been watching him for some time put into words what many were thinking. No one has ever spoken like this man. South Dakota. This book is a small effort to encourage men to think seriously about what it takes to become godly men, men who some in their communities will consider elders, men who will be known more for their godly influence than for their talents and achievements. Our culture is now divided into two groups of people, some important experts, trained theologians, popular pastors, influential businessmen, trained professionals, inspiring seminary leaders, self-help experts, and middle-class people who live comfortably with their good jobs and beautiful children. Good people who teach in the young couples class, in the church, and all the rest, the ordinary people who go about their daily lives enjoying whatever pleasure they can get and enduring difficulties as best they can. These are the people who lack the soft cushions of money, comfort, and prestige to protect them from the hard questions and real pain. People who wonder if what they experience is really all there is to life. Imagine what it would be like if our Christian communities were made up, not of experts and ordinary people, but of elders and disciples, elders, men and women who know God well, and who would insist, of course, that they barely know Him. But who would live to know Him better? And 100 disciples, vast gatherings of people, whose hearts have been awakened by the possibility of truly knowing Christ, a possibility that they see demonstrated in the lives of the truly mature. If reform is to come, it will be through the elders, not the experts. If ordinary men are to become fathers, or experts are to become elders, we need to have some idea of what godly masculinity looks like. We need to have an image of true masculinity that leads us, first, to brokenness, making our masculine flaws obvious, and then, fires us up with a relentless passion to achieve the tremendous potential of becoming real men. So I begin this chapter with a basic question: what does a godly man look like? You can replace the expression manly man with godly man. They are both the same. Is he strong, confident, tough, and successful? Are you powerful, dedicated to your purposes, able to keep under control the emotions that could interfere with achieving your goals? Do you keep moving against all obstacles, never allowing yourself to give in to the urge to panic or cry? Will your enjoyment be greater? Does the depth come from what he accomplished, rather than what people feel when they are with him. That's the traditional view. Real men are tough enough to lead and make decisions and always be on the go. But over the last 10 or 20 years, this view has taken a serious blow. From pulpits, in conferences, and through books, it has been encouraged, sometimes commanded. Modern men to show their sensitive side, to feel comfortable with vulnerability and emotional displays, to stop thinking of themselves as superior to women, to release that part of themselves. His humanity that yearns more to associate than to realize. Men who live according to God's design, this thought suggests, are gentler, kinder, and more attentive than we thought they should be. Aggression and power, those traditional manly qualities that drive men to go out and fight the world while women stay at home, are now scorned as cultural errors, perversions of true masculinity. In our modern understanding, anything legitimate about the pioneer spirit belongs to both women and men. And whatever is attractive in domestic life should attract both men and women to the home and the warmth it provides. We are told that we should no longer see men hunting while women weave. These stereotypes are more related to a long history of patriarchal thinking than to scripture. This is what many think today. But men find it very difficult to put down their bows and arrows and pick up threads and needles. The modern men's movement, now in full swing, arose partly in reaction to the idea that men should become more relationally sensitive, more effeminate, as some have expressed Robert Bly's idea in his book, Iron John. He wrote of a burning within all men that is waiting to move powerfully through life. In Fire in the Betty, Sam Keen added his vibrant call to instill fire in our guts, to embrace and release our deepest passions. None of these men, nor most of the later leaders of the men's movement, wanted to return to John Wayne's style of masculinity, in which men were tougher than tender, but they expressed a legitimate concern that something primitive and basic in the nature of masculinity is in danger of being lost in the culture's struggle to define it. And I agree. Something was lost. But what exactly? The idea of a primitive ardor found resonance among men. Thousands of people have heard the call to live passions more basic than success and sex. When men come together in large Promise Keepers gatherings and decide to honor their responsibilities, something deep in their hearts is released. And for that we should all be grateful. Ardor, passion, determination, are these the fundamental qualities of masculinity that have been lost and are now rediscovered? For reasons set out in the rest of this book, I think we are already closer to the absolute core of masculinity, but we have not yet reached it, from what we have seen so far in the men's movements. Something was lost. Something is wrong with men. Something good that God put inside every man, something that comes to life only through regeneration, has not been released in most men. For this reason there are so few men who are priests. As a way of presenting my understanding of masculinity, let me encourage you to think of masculinity as an energy, a natural impulse within the heart of every man, a power and impetus to move through life in a particular direction. Men in whom masculine energy is suppressed or distorted are unmanly and ungodly men, no matter what that the culture considers them. Men will be manly only when they live in the power of released masculine energy. But what exactly do I mean by this? To develop a clearer idea of what it looks like. Liberated masculinity, perhaps it would be more useful to take a brief look at an inauthentic man, someone whose virile energy remains dormant or who expresses himself in a corrupt way. Not authentic men. If you are in a relationship with an unmanly man, you will probably notice. Controller, impersonally powerful. Destructive, or dangerous. Selfish, committed, above all, to feeling a certain way about oneself. The unmanly man controls conversations, manipulates family and friends, organizes your life to avoid anything you are not sure you can handle. He doesn't trust anyone, not deeply. He works hard to put himself in a favorable position, a position from which he emerges victorious or at least uncontested. He's not a good listener. He rarely asks meaningful questions, preferring to offer opinions or remain silent. No one feels wanted by him, except when his friendship can be an advantage. When he shows interest in you, he gives the impression of a car salesman asking to see a photo of your family. He is destructive. Their words and actions hurt people, although colleagues may feel encouraged and challenged for a time, sometimes for a long time. Family members feel the hurt sooner and more deeply, but are often too afraid to admit it, even to themselves. Often the veneer of goodness and affability is so thick that the damage is only felt with a cumulative power that slowly destroys, like small traces of poison in the water we drink. He can hurt people directly with sarcasm and sheer malice, occasionally with violence. More often, the damage is caused by indifference and withdrawal, the kinds of weapons that make you feel guilty or uncomfortable when attacked. The wife of an unmanly man rarely feels appreciated. She may never tell you this, but she often feels used, belittled, or hated. This man's children and friends keep their distance. They are too angry or too scared to approach. Their selfishness is not always evident, but it is clearly revealed in difficult times. Despite kindness and sometimes extravagant generosity, a final commitment to his own well-being clearly emerges in the end. Unmanly men are controlling, destructive, and selfish. But these characteristics describe only what is visible to others, what people feel in their presence. Scrape below the surface, which is sometimes thick, and you will discover that, supporting these weeds, there is a root system that has a stubborn life of its own. At depths that often remain unexplored, castrated men feel powerless in the face of their determination to control. A hate-filled rage energizes their destructive capacity, and they are terrified to the point of seeing selfishness as their only hope for survival. Look inside the unmanly man and you will find a helpless, angry, and terrified man trying to make his life work through control, intimidation, and selfishness. The first three characteristics, controlling, intimidating, selfish, are typical of the style in which the castrated man relates, typical of how he shows himself. The second three, helpless, angry, and terrified. They represent the battles that are fought deep in your soul, beneath your relationship style. Let's take a closer look at this second set of characteristics, which represents what is occurring within the castrated male. Powerless, Brent had a history of withdrawing from women well into his life. At which point the next step would be to reach a compromise. He explained this pattern this way: I'm just not sure I can make a relationship work. What will happen if she demands that I do something that I cannot do? That is, someone that I am not. Men who feel helpless like things to be predictable. They don't like surprises. The unexpected is an exciting adventure only when it occurs in areas in which the unmanly man feels especially competent. Adrenaline flows in an experienced surgeon when something goes wrong on the operating table. Maybe later he will admit that he was afraid, but he does what needs to be done in the moment and he does it well. Entrepreneurs with a track record of success sometimes demonstrate nerves of steel and good judgment in crises that leave inferior men falling, trembling, to their knees. Experienced plumbers with a talent for spotting what's wrong and knowing exactly what to fix get bored with clogged pipes and routine leaks. The biggest problems give them a chance to show what they know. Intellectuals are up to the challenge of a debate. They welcome a counterargument like a bull welcomes the red cloak. It is a call to attack. Surgeon, executive, plumber, or intellectual. He gives it all himself. Uncertainty offers an exciting challenge to men. Men only when it occurs in areas in which they feel confident in their ability. But behind the confidence of the most talented man, there is a fear that does not diminish. Unmanly men are tormented by the possibility that something will happen that they cannot resolve, something that will force them into unknown territory, where their suitability has not been proven, where their proven talents may prove useless. Every honest man feels this. Fear. The unmanly man feels nothing more intense than this fear, but he denies how strong it is for him. Otherwise, strong men may feel terrified of having to speak in a Sunday school class, talk to their daughters about sex, choose the right restaurant for a wedding anniversary celebration, or express their deepest feelings to their friends. Not surprisingly, unmanly men feel most helpless in an area that no one can effectively control: personal relationships. Getting closer to their wives, feeling wise enough to be respected by their children, building healthy intimacy with friends, these are areas that have the power to make men feel powerless. To hide their helplessness, impotent men find something they can control, something they can handle well, and avoid what they fear. They then consider anything they can control important and spend most of their energy operating it. This can be something as banal as keeping your car clean, as wrong as seducing another woman, as irritating as trivializing every serious conversation with a joke, as well received as writing a review of culture that appears on the bestseller list, or as consuming as a growing business or expanding ministry. Powerless men spend their lives controlling some outcome and fooling themselves into thinking it is important. Angry. Angry men get angry easily. They become exasperated when someone asks them to operate outside their sphere of competence, to use resources they are not sure they have. When his wife asks for his participation, the angry man tends to think about what he has already given her, usually a list of material things: look at the house we live in. Sins not committed: I have always been faithful to you. Or comparisons: please talk to other men, at least I'm not glued to the TV, watching sports every night like your brother. We go out to dinner with friends, I go to church every Sunday, and I even take Susanna to classes piano. What more do you want? Unmanly men are easy to provoke. It doesn't take anything big to trigger the explosion of anger that is never far from the surface. Life itself continually demands that men do more than they believe they are capable of. Responsibilities never diminish. Flossing today doesn't mean you can stop flossing tomorrow. And even faithful flossing doesn't guarantee an A at the dentist. When you leave the dentist's office without hearing the hum of the engine, the joy does not last long. A mole appears on his back and the color is strange. Or your teen brings home a terrible report card. You don't know if he's lazy, on drugs, or if the problem is his lack of ability to concentrate. Maybe he needs those good medicines that make kids less likely to be distracted. Maybe a private Christian school. That's why your air conditioning stops working just when summer arrives. His wife tells him that she hasn't felt courted in a long time. And you want to kill, hit, scream. There are times in life when everything goes wrong. And there are seasons, usually shorter, when most things go well. Everyone gets along. The IRS owes him a tax refund, and his daughter is dating the president of the youth group. But even during the good times, you're aware of a vague apprehension that seems ominous, like a single dark cloud hanging over your picnic. Well, give me a break. We cry, to no one in particular, not even to God, if we admit that our fury is directed against him. And life, or God, seems to answer. Get ready. The other shoe will drop. When? I want to surprise you. That's enough to drive anyone crazy. And anger, the kind that most of us feel reliably, justifies actions that, to a non-angry mind, would easily be recognized as wrong. Actions that seem right to us when we are angry cause harm to others and make us feel better. We like both effects. But satisfaction is superficial and brief. It ends up giving way to emptiness. And we feel less able to cope with life's incessant demand that we keep moving. There comes a point where we can only think about revenge. The loud impulse to destroy does not become a fixed pattern in most men, but rather reaches a boiling point and ferocious intensity at unexpected moments. Unmanly men feel strangely good when they sense within themselves a power capable of destroying. And they feel even better when they let go. This release of corrupt masculine energy can take the form of sarcasm, insiders-only jokes that deliberately exclude others, using a brilliant intellect to intimidate, or simple negligence. It can be experienced more violently through fantasies or physical abuse. When a man does not experience the joy that only the release of masculine energy can create, he is drawn to the pleasure of power. Destructive men are not manly. They are crazy about the energy of distorted masculinity. They are crazy about people and about life. They are crazy about God. They are full of vengeful judgments against everyone but themselves. When I follow someone slowly down a flight of stairs, I sometimes feel the need to help them go down faster. The idea of pushing someone and watching them roll down the stairs can be tempting. Terrified. What if life reveals me as a failure, someone who cannot afford basic needs? What if I can't effectively address issues that, I must admit, are really important? And if I ruin everything, my family, my friends, my job, and be left alone, a naked loser for everyone to see? What if I face the fact that all my money, my material possessions, and the good times didn't fill that terrible void that exists deep within me? Unmanly men live with a silent terror that, like high blood pressure, kills slowly and silently. The terror will not go away. It usually remains hidden under the cloak of success, sociability, and routine. Sometimes it explodes. And when it does, these unmanly men panic or become depressed. Sometimes they feel the need to commit suicide, kill another person, or enjoy the unique pleasures of immorality. Whether terror remains silent or bursts into consciousness, it demands relief. Anything that can bring relief seems reasonable, entirely legitimate. But while the idea of hitting your dog or yelling at your wife has some appeal, it seems better to find a way to get instant, reliable pleasure. This mitigates the terror with a consuming joy that involves no risk. The options are many. Pornographic pleasure is as close as the newsboy on the corner. If buying Playboy is beyond the line you haven't yet crossed, similar pleasures are available to you in your imagination and memory. A visit to the restaurant where the waitress works shapely figure, the one that always smiles at you, will help you. The goal is relief, ready, reliable, and easy to obtain. Enjoying God is a more difficult job. Terrified men want relief now. Let me summarize. When masculine energy is not released, when it is suppressed or distorted, they feel helpless, so they compensate by dedicating themselves to controlling something. They become aggressive men. They experience fury and become convinced that they are owed revenge. They become abusive men. They live with a terror for which there is no solution or escape, only relief. They mitigate terror with physical pleasure and become addicted men. Male men. The authentic man is very different. When the energy that God put inside man is released, the man knows that he is strong, not powerless. Strong men take the initiative even when they are not sure what to do. Their vocation to reflect God, in their way of relating, motivates them more than their desire for power, or your fear of powerlessness. The manly man is not a man. Aggressive is an active man, involved in providing good quality relationships to others, more dedicated to developing a strength that others can enjoy, than in gaining a sense of power and control for himself. This man experiences a less angry lifestyle. Don't feel so threatened. Some call it peace. To him, the phrase, more than a conqueror, means something, even during the difficult moments of life. The manly man's pain does not prevent him from feeling the situation of others, even when their difficulties are less acute than his own. He has the courage to face his experience honestly. Therefore, he feels the sadness of living in a fallen world and the loneliness of living in an imperfect community. But your sadness and loneliness generate only holy anger, the kind that arouses compassion for people while still being offended by sin. The liberated man is not abusive. He is a meek man, not weak, a man whose power is controlled for good purposes. This man finds an answer to his terror in freedom. No matter what happens in life, virile men always find room to move. There is always something to be, even when there is nothing to do. When their families fall apart or their businesses collapse, virile men, and also unvirile ones, are tempted to explode in revenge or retreat into relief. But they do neither. They are attracted by the opportunity to demonstrate something good, to reflect the always hopeful movement of God. They go through tribulations with a presence that others, more than themselves, can notice. Manly men are seduced by the enjoyment of freedom, by the unhindered opportunity to follow the calling of masculinity. The virile man is not addicted. He treats the body severely, to avoid the danger of submitting to the power of another. He fights hard against his relentless desire for pleasure. It moves according to a plan. He is a determined man who knows what he does and what he can contribute to the purpose for which he lives. Every day, we move closer or further away from godly manhood. One of the great tragedies of our day is that so many men are following a path that they believe will lead them to legitimate masculinity. It may take many years before those going in the wrong direction realize that the path they have been following releases more corrupt energy than genuine masculine energy, and that this path leaves them even more helpless, bitter, and terrified. There is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death. Proverbs 14:14. Before discussing the essence of true masculinity, I want to think about the deep passion in men that keeps them walking the path away from godly masculinity. Chapter 3. Theology of Recipes. They were both nervous and furious. It was her first session with Dr. Gilberto, the marriage counselor her pastor had recommended. Toward the end of their first year of marriage, she had started talking about getting help. He had never liked the idea. I thought they could fix things on their own. If she hadn't threatened to leave him, he wouldn't be sitting in Dr. Gilberto's office now, 2 weeks before they completed 2 years of marriage. He was 29 years old. She was a year younger. She seemed nervous. It was almost certain that he would not give that impression. "Look, I'll go to a session," he had told his wife, "to see if this guy knows what he's talking about." After offering coffee, which they both declined, Dr. Gilberto began the conversation very directly. "Tell me what brings you here." There's no need to beat around the bush, the boy thought. He liked it. Kind, but direct. She didn't need a wider door to enter, and she began with words that her husband had heard before. "Dr. Gilberto, our marriage is really in trouble." For almost 15 minutes, she punished her husband with one story after another. A courtship and commitment full of ups and downs, then, a marriage full of downs. Almost constant fights. No real intimacy. None. Just sex. "I can't take much more. I didn't get married for this." And then he ended the attack with his best-known complaint. "Every time I try to tell him how I feel, he lectures me about how wrong I am or just doesn't say anything." Then the husband decided to speak. And this time no invitation from Dr. Gilberto was necessary. "Look, I have already told him more than 1,000 times that I am willing to do whatever is necessary to make our marriage work. I love her. I even went to a seminar with her that she thought might help. And I really tried to do everything that guy said. A lot of things about how to communicate better, about telling her I love her in ways she can hear, about taking some steps that he assured me would put the shine back in my life. Our relationship." He stopped to study the counselor's face. Dr. Gilberto seemed neither convinced nor skeptical. The boy continued. "Our pastor told my wife that you were very good, so I agreed to try it. You are right about one thing. We don't really get along. I thought if I had a toothache I would go to the dentist, so if my marriage needs fixing, I think it makes sense to see a counselor." At that moment he almost jumped out of his chair. "Do you see what he looks like?" He thundered. "I want a man who will have a relationship with me, so we can share each other's lives. He wants to fix something that's broken. It makes our marriage look like a broken-down car." Then, more softly, through tears, she continued, "I am not a broken thing. I am a person, a woman, who just wants to be loved. I just don't know if we will ever be happy together." Tears ran freely down her face. He hated when she cried. It always made something move inside him. He felt helpless. Also angry and afraid, but more helpless than anything else. She continued crying. He sat motionless. Dr. Gilberto broke the silence. Tell me what's going through your head right now. The question was directed at her husband. He could only shrug his shoulders and say, I just don't know what to do. South Dakota. When I was a child, I often lay on my back on the warm summer grass just before going to bed and looked at the starry sky. I remember feeling small and enjoying that feeling. I think it was because I knew there was something big I fit into, something much bigger than me. I didn't know what that something was, but I knew it was related to a great story God was telling. I wanted to know that story and I wanted to be part of it. Since then I have discovered that contemplating the sky is a very different experience from studying in a library, writing a doctoral thesis, or receiving advice in a professional office. Looking at the stars allows me to consider the bigger picture. Other activities tend to absorb me in smaller details. My responsibilities as an adult have largely been driven by the need to understand things, understanding, for example, why some men have homosexual impulses while others struggle with depression, and know how to overcome problems. That's what the psychologist should do, find out what's wrong and fix it. And that's what today's Bible teachers, pastors, and other Christian leaders are also expected to do, become experts in how to address the real problems of life. If they are successful, they will be known as competent people. If they are not, they will be exposed as weak or discarded as not being terribly useful. Either way, Christian leaders and helpers seem more interested in the minutiae of life than in the bigger picture, the one I saw painted in the sky, where the glory of God is declared and the work of His hands is proclaimed. Psalm 19, 1. As a result, the theological statements emerging from modern culture seem more like prescriptions for life than stated truths about God. Transcendental theology, which emerges from a broader perspective, has been replaced by prescription theology, a way of thinking that remains focused on the details of life. The center of transcendental theology is God, His character and purposes. The center of the theology of prescription is man, his needs and his well-being. This type of thinking affects the way we approach our daily lives. Take our example at the beginning of this chapter, the story of a husband governed by two assumptions involving minutiae. Someone knows what he should do to resolve this particular marital crisis, and, if he finds that person and follows him, with your advice, the marriage will improve. The seminar leader was not the designated expert. Maybe the counselor has the formula that will make your marriage work. Most of us naturally think this way. We want to believe that someone knows exactly what we should do to solve our problems, and depending on the size of our problems, we are willing to do whatever someone suggests. We have become a culture of experts and followers, all determined to understand the details of life. Listen to some examples of how to think according to a formula. Do you want to know how to recover from the damage you suffered in childhood? Here are the ingredients that God provides. Combine them according to His plan, and you will have a delicious meal of self-improvement. Maybe you need to make a decision about your job, or better deal with the stress of the job you have now. Here are some biblical principles to guide you. Apply them to your life, and soon you will feel the confidence to move forward and the joy of knowing that you are at the center of God's will. Are you angry? Can't find intimacy with your spouse or resolve tension with a friend? Here is God's recipe for getting rid of anger, resolving tension, and developing intimacy. And remember, His medicine always works. This thorough approach to life affects the way man, pious or ungodly, he sees himself. When a man feels forced by circumstances to throw up his hands and admit, I have no idea what to do, he feels like less of a man, and so he does nothing. Indecisive husbands and boyfriends, agreeable cowards, complaining victims, these are visibly weak men. They spend their lives immobile. Like a flag flying high on a calm day, these men do not move except to do such manly things as yelling at women and weaker men, drinking too much, or masturbating while thinking about their family fantasies. In a culture that expects men to know what to do, it is difficult to confront a problem that has no formula for its solution. Men often report that they feel more like a man when they can say, "I may not know what to do with this, but I know what to do with that. I know I can do it. I am doing it and it is working." These men may be successful businessmen, but distant fathers. Because they live within the limits of their competence, they are generally unaware of any struggle with their sense of masculinity. They only face those problems that they are quite sure they can solve. Men who feel like men are not necessarily manly. Men who feel like men, because of their competence, rarely realize those areas that they call that, things they are not sure how to deal with. They involve your most important relationships and the areas you call that, things you deal with well. Involve their most significant relationships, they are more tied to non-relational tasks that they comfortably perform. Men who depend for their sense of well-being on performing tasks they can perform are generally not efficient in their intimate relationships. They often refuse to allow their wives to express how alone, hurt, and misunderstood they feel. Whatever concerns they hear, they will either fix them or ignore them. These men take their children to soccer games, but they never take them for long walks. And they don't reveal their struggles to anyone, especially their children. Competent men do not know how to listen or share openly. They may have good times with their daughters, lots of laughter, light-hearted banter, and angry promises of protection. "If any boy hurts you, I'll beat him up." But they have few conversations with them. They don't know much about intimate two-way conversations. Because they have no opportunity to relax into a deep goodness sufficient to absorb their evil, nor to rest in a strong and lasting love, the wives and daughters of the competent man find it difficult to take time off. They have to keep things going. Competent men create strong women. I suggest that the man is at his most manly when he admits, "I don't know what to do in this situation, but I know it's important for me to get involved and do something. Therefore, I will try to visualize what God might want to happen in this person's life or in this circumstance, and I will move toward that vision with whatever wisdom and power God provides me." The virile man moves, even when there is no income. My disagreement with formula theology is not with the biblical principles it enunciates or with its demand that we follow them. Rather, it is due to their tendency to turn biblical principles into a formula for success. God did not write a book of formulas for life, with recipes for any dish you want to prepare. He responds to our individual situations by inviting us to participate in a story larger than our lives. Formula theology studies the minutiae of life to help us better tell our story. God invites us to join him in telling his story. I wonder if the central passion that governs our culture today is the passion to make life work. We think it should work, if not life. In general, then, certainly, our life at any given moment. We should feel good about ourselves, enjoy friendships, earn a living wage, find a doctor who can cure us, and receive respect from our peers. Experts exist to help make life work. God too. When experts decide to ask God for help, they become recipe theologians. We are very short-sighted. Because why are we drawn to life in the small picture and not inspired by the opportunity to be elevated to the bigger picture where God is drawing it? Why is it so difficult to even question the premise that life is supposed to work, much less give up our right to have someone tell us how to manage it well? Why is recipe theology so popular? Is it because, like all generations before ours, we have managed to leave at least one vital point of biblical truth to the bottom and have thus developed a distorted concept of Christianity and the Christian life? In the day of Martin Luther, the Church had lost sight of the doctrine of grace. The result was a theology of the recipe for indulgence in good works. I wonder if in our day we have lost the excitement and drama of our calling, to reveal the invisible God by the way we live, especially by the way we relate to one another. The most important truth about people is the truth most easily ignored: we reflect the image of God. As his image bearers, we are called to tell his story with our lives, no, tell our stories with his resources. When we neglect this truth, The call to be like God is reduced to a whisper, and the invitation to make our lives work better becomes a shout. We tend to be recovering addicts. How can I feel better? Or tough realists. How can I feel better? Stand out. The truth about revealing God to others through our lives has been reduced to religious rhetoric to which we give our pro forma consent. In the meantime, we are doing the real work of fixing our lives and putting ourselves in a comfortable position. We prefer practical help to a higher calling to live by design. The difficulty, of course, is this: we will never solve our problems well or fulfill our responsibilities with spiritual motivation until we honor the call to reflect the image of God and decide to know Him well. Start with prescription theology and you will never rise above yourself. Start with transcendent theology and you will eventually become the person you were designed to be. Let me explain. Today, the most important themes within prescription theology are solving problems, the call to healing, and fulfill responsibilities, the call to obedience. We worry about feeling good or feel pressured to do the right thing. None of these things elevate us into God's larger story or invite us to participate in it. Those who think that nothing matters more than alleviating the pain of a severely damaged identity, or learning to be valued and accepted in a loving relationship, will find themselves drawn into the minutiae of a prescriptive theology for recovery. They will look for an expert who can guide them toward a fuller, freer, and happier experience in a difficult world. Commitment to duty may be strongly encouraged, but when things get really bad, finding happiness will take priority over keeping promises. Someone I was counseling once told me, "As a man, I feel so much better about myself when I'm with another woman. I know it's wrong, but I can't imagine God wants me to be with my wife if we make each other so unhappy." Experts at the other extreme, those who specialize in firm exhortation, think less about enjoying God as Abba and more about obeying Him as if He were a sergeant. This emphasis finds expression in a very different theology, which remains a prescription, but with a systematic focus on the minutiae of responsibility. The effect is presumption, more moral superiority than joy and more pressure than freedom. A friend once went to a counselor who, in the first session, gave him a list of Bible verses, printed out on a computer, and told him to memorize each one. When people try to manage their lives by working hard just to produce better, they either fail and start living defensively, or they do well and become proud. These two mistakes leave us in a sphere of life that we think we can handle. We like to think that there are steps we can take toward healing or that our duties to God can be laid out before us, like a well-lit path we can walk along. So things seem clear. We know what to do. We never need to leave the sphere of governance. Therefore, we never learn the dependence and trust that only grows in darkness. But think what would happen if we found the courage to go beyond the manageable tasks of life and enter the realm of mystery, where there are no practical answers and the courage to enter chaos is more important than the discipline to follow rules or steps. Suppose an angry father, focused solely on finding a cure for his temper, could feel elated at the opportunity to lead his son into the heart of God. Maybe he didn't know exactly what to do, but the energy that would flow from him to his son would be different. If we could move the recipes away from center stage, perhaps the good principles they teach could once again be seen as ways of knowing and reflecting God, rather than techniques to promote inner healing or requirements of mechanical obedience. Perhaps, then, the character and purposes of God would regain their rightful place in our thinking and lead to the development of a transcendent theology. The starting point for understanding masculinity and transforming into spiritual and virile men is not a formula for developing masculinity, nor a list of ingredients to mix. We must begin with God's unique call to men. How were men designed to be like God in ways that women were not? What is our special transcendent calling? Encouraging men to release those deeply masculine capacities, which first existed in God and then were instilled in men, and helping them to reflect those characteristics requires the wisdom of someone who is sensitive to who God is and what He does. This requires a transcendent theologian. The experience of a theologian of recipes simply does not work. Income theology fits best into what I call the management sphere. Transcendent theology is necessary if we want to move in the sphere of mystery. Everything in life can be divided into one of these two spheres. Men naturally insist on operating within the sphere of administration. Men who are on the path to authentic masculinity find the courage to enter the sphere of mystery. Let me define my terms. The sphere of management exists where things are more or less predictable, where there is an order that can be understood well enough that we can use it to make our lives work the way we want. The sphere of mystery exists whenever we are faced with things that are ultimately unpredictable, where whatever order exists cannot be understood well enough to give us the control we desire. In the sphere of management, we can move forward with the confidence that we have at least some power to control things, set goals, and pursue them according to a workable plan. In the sphere of mystery, we can only move by trusting in someone we trust but can never control. Whatever goals fall into this realm become questions for prayer, as long as our energy is devoted to pleasing God, not making anything happen. The tendency in our culture is to define relationships, including our relationship with God, as a task and then figure out what to do to make it work. We like to think that growing in Christ and developing strong relationships fall under the purview of stewardship. So we put them there and try to decide what to do. Men prefer to do something they can achieve, and recipe theology lights the way. We need to return to a transcendent theology that allows us to enter the darkness, where God does his deepest work. We need to learn what it means to surrender to God and relate powerfully to others. This will require us to enter the dark sphere of mystery. Chapter 4. Entering the darkness. The tears that came, this time, were different, more desperate. Not like the petulant tears that sometimes broke out when he didn't feel taken seriously. And not at all like the moody tears, which made him feel like a demanding child who didn't get what he wanted. These tears were different. They seemed cleaner, beyond the hurt and pain. I pout, not the kind that left torrents of self-loathing in its wake. He quickly left to be alone, wanting her to follow him but not feeling weak for wanting this, knowing that neither she nor anyone else could give him enough comfort to stop his tears. For one terrible moment, as he stood in front of the parapet looking out at the lake, he could see the black hole, the one he had always known was there but had never seen before, at least not so clearly. The serene beauty of the placid blue water, reflecting the rugged, snow-capped peaks of the Canadian Rockies, offered a dramatic contrast to the heartbreaking agony where there was nothing but darkness, no answers, no beauty, no power, without meaning, without love. He was worried to the core of his being, and it was all triggered by a moment of misunderstanding with his wife. That moment now seemed like an innocent door that, once opened, had sucked him into the darkness of darkness. Terror rose slowly, like a piece of food that didn't agree with him, until it exploded out of his mouth with unwanted force. I don't know what to do. The cry was not directed at anyone, unless God was listening. He heard no response, no reassuring whisper, no comforting presence. The loneliness seemed even more severe to him. Could this be a taste of hell? Endless pain, no one to help me, absolute isolation. But he wasn't in hell. The lake in front of him was of incomparable beauty. His wife stood nearby, delicate concern flowing freely from her oppressed heart. And he knew that he was in the presence of God, the hidden and silent God who was certainly there. How strange, he thought. How desperate humiliation can seem. Being in total dependence because you are completely lost. This thought seemed alive to him and came out of nowhere. But still, there is no consolation. The darkness was so thick you could feel it. He couldn't move. Go to your wife and apologize? But his biggest fault, although he still couldn't put it into words. It was against God. Hug her. But only a loved one can truly love another person. Review the conflict? Useless. Another opportunity to show your selfishness. I don't know what to do. The scream sounded again. Nothing made sense. His guilt, his coldness, and his selfishness made him feel trapped, paralyzed. Can someone tell me what to do? Then the question seemed dead to him. He lost all interest. I knew there would be no answers, that demanding answers would be useless. Then, another path began to open before him. Something more disturbing than his ignorance demanded attention. And suddenly he heard something. They were words that came out of his own mind. New words, unplanned, spontaneous, but entirely welcome. The darkness had blinded him. He still could not see, and what he now heard in the darkness, he had never heard in the light. I'm really in the dark, he heard himself say. I don't know what to do. I'm completely confused, totally perplexed and deeply scared. I feel isolated from God. This place I am in reduces me to two options: wait out the blues and then just move on as best I can, or surrender to God. There is no point in just continuing. The darkness always returns and, each time, deeper, to confront me again with the stupid choice I made and push me in desperation to a new choice. Darkness, that terrible and benevolent angel, clarifies everything. There is nothing to do except have confidence. Oh God, with all my heart I surrender to you. Please burn the flesh and fill me with your spirit. You are more than worthy of my complete trust. Thank you for the darkness that stopped me long enough to hear your voice. He took his wife's hands and walked slowly back to the bedroom. There was still no intimacy between them. Neither of them felt what they both expected to feel. The joy of the honeymoon did not materialize. But he felt that something much better awaited them. And with this conviction he realized that he wanted to move in the direction of God, in the direction of his wife, in the direction of life, as he had never done before. His wife felt the awakening of hope. Men are called to enter the darkness, to continue moving forward with purpose and strength, even when they can't clearly see the path ahead. Observations from the creation record in Genesis will help us see that God has already done what he calls men to do. Observation number 1. The first thing that is revealed about God, in the Bible, is that he is the creator and that he created speaking I in the dark. This observation is discussed in chapters 4 and 5. Observation number 2. The first thing that is revealed about man in the Bible is suggested by the Hebrew word, in Genesis 1 verse 27, which is translated into Portuguese as masculine. Chapter 6 reflects on the importance of this word. Observation number 3. The first thing God said to Adam was name of the animals. Adam was called to bring order into existence through the spoken word, where there was no order before, just as God had done in creation. When Adam spoke, there was order. When he fell silent, chaos returned. The implications of Adam speaking and remaining silent are discussed in chapter 7. We have seen what happens when men follow our culture to the point of not being manly. The search for solutions using prescription theology has given us an approach to life that only sees the minutiae, an approach that uncovers the opposite of true masculinity and distances us from mystery and faith. Now continue our thinking a little further. Man, like God, was destined to speak in the darkness and become a storyteller. After Jesus' death, two men walked toward the town of Emmaus, sharing their disappointment over the events of the last few days. They didn't understand, but they thought about it as they walked. The Bible says, on the way, he spoke about everything that had happened, Luke 24 verse 14. Maybe they wanted to understand. Jesus, whom they did not recognize but considered a stranger, joined them on their way and asked them what they were talking about. They both thought his question was strange and thought he must be from another city. Now, what else was there to discuss? The events surrounding Jesus' death and everything that had happened last week were so confusing that they couldn't think of anything else. All hope was gone. Nothing made sense anymore. Everything was a mystery, a confusing, inopportune and dark mystery. Jesus listened to them talk for a few minutes. And then, still standing and with an authority that stopped them, He looked at them sternly and said to them, "How difficult you are to understand and how slow to understand. Believe in everything the prophets said. Christ should not have suffered these things to enter into yours glory." Luke 24 verses 25 and 26. And he walked again, and as they followed him, they listened to a Bible study led by the author. Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, they explained to them what is said about him in all the scriptures, Luke 24 verse 27. They later reported that their hearts burned in their chests as they heard him reveal the Christ. When we open our Bibles from the beginning, as Jesus might have done with his two traveling companions, the first thing we learn is that God is the creator of everything. The second thing we learn is that he made all of his initial creation in darkness. Listen to the first two sentences of the Bible. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. First sentence. The earth was informal and empty, darkness covered the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved over the face of the waters. Second sentence. The rest of Genesis 1 informs us that God spoke into that empty, formless darkness. He entered that sphere of primordial mystery with imaginative power that, out of confusion, aroused beauty and life. God spoke 10 times. The first 4, he gave form to a formless world. He established order. Genesis 1 verses 3 and 6, 9, 11. The next 4 times, God filled the void with the beauty of life. Genesis 1 verses 14 and 20, 24, 26. The last 2 times, God revealed his heart to the people he created, blessing them with meaningful work to honor his dignity. Genesis 1 verse 28. And with generous provision for their physical needs. Genesis 1, 2930. He had already given himself and others. They no longer had any other personal needs. Now, take a short break. Is there anything in this story that speaks of Christ? Paul told us that it was Christ who made all things, Colossians 1 verse 16. It was Christ who spoke in the darkness to bring order and beauty out of chaos. What would the Creator have said to his 2 friends on the road to Emmaus when he told them about the 10 times, so long ago, that he entered into the mystery of water shrouded in darkness to create life? What would he have revealed about himself that would have the power to transform those 2 men into old men? In the beginning, before Christ spoke, there was nothing but water, wild, cold, addictive water, covered by an impenetrable blanket of darkness. It is important to remember that God spoke to this darkness to create life. Peter suggests that there is a connection between forgetting how God created the world and becoming a godless people. Listen to what it says. In the last days scoffers will arise, scoffers and following their own passions. But they deliberately forget that long ago, word of God, there are heavens and earth, the latter formed of water and a branch. 2 Peter 3 verses 3 and 5. Apparently, if we forget that God created by speaking in the dark, we are in danger of becoming evil. Because. What does this mean? At first glance, the 2 things don't seem related. But the connection between remembering that God spoke in the darkness and becoming evil begins to become clear when we understand what darkness God spoke in. In the next chapters, we will suggest that men are called to enter with wisdom into the darkest regions of the world. Their worlds. They must speak powerful words in the confusion of life with the same energy that flowed from Christ when he spoke in the darkness. Colossians 1 verses 16 and 29. The meaning of darkness. The Bible talks about different types of darkness. There is the darkness of secrecy, or evil, a darkness loved by people whose actions are evil. John 3:19. Christians were called out of this darkness into the light of full revelation and total forgiveness. 1 Peter 2 verse 9. Such a blanket of darkness, like the streets of Dickens's London, keeps evil deeds hidden. It has no place in the nature of God. In him there is no darkness. No region is kept secret to avoid revealing a defect. Jude refers to a related concept when he tells us that rebellious angels are kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains until the judgment of the great day. Jude 1 verse 6. This is the darkness of judgment, that terrible thing that happens when God, who is light, completely withdraws. But there is a third type of darkness mentioned in the scriptures. They are the darkness that covered the waters, in which God spoke when He created life. This darkness is more related to disorder and random chaos than to hidden evil or the punishment of evil. It is the darkness over which the Spirit of God hovered in the first scene of Scripture, suggesting the expectation that something was about to happen. This is the darkness of confusion, of chance that is about to give way to the light of order and beauty, a useless chaos totally devoid of form and any spark of light, but, nevertheless, a chaos that can be transformed into something wonderful. The darkness of confusion is so thick that it stops all natural movement. When God covered Egypt with darkness, the same word that appears in Genesis 1 verse 2 is used in Exodus 10 verses 21 and 22. It was darkness that could be felt. No one moved for 3 days. When the tour guide turns off the lights in a cave, he doesn't need to tell people to stay still. In the darkness that completely eliminates vision, no one moves. When God gave the law on Mount Sinai, the mountain was surrounded by darkness, and clouds, and obscurity, Deuteronomy 4 verse 11, again the same word. The people, the passage says, heard the words, but they saw no form, only the voice was heard, Deuteronomy 4 verse 12. In the darkness of confusion, you cannot see, but you can hear. At least you can hear the voice of God. Natural movement, which depends on vision, stops completely in the dark. But supernatural movement, both the movement of God and the movement of man who walks by faith and not by sight, is possible even in the darkest darkness. When the curtain rises and the biblical drama begins, we immediately see Christ center stage. The story begins with God confronting the original sphere of mystery, the darkness that covered the empty, formless waters. There was no design, no order, no beauty, no life, only darkness. The Spirit hovers over the darkness. Then God speaks. With power greater than darkness, He enters the mystery and gives life through His word. Now let's pay attention to something meaningful in our study of masculinity. The first thing that God told man was to name the animals, the creatures that He could have named, but He didn't. He brought them to the man to see what he would call them, and the name that the man gave them may see at being alive, that would be his name, Genesis 2 verse 19. God placed the responsibility of naming animals on the man, not the woman. Eve hadn't even been created yet. As God, man was called to speak in the darkness, to enter the confusion of a completely nameless animal kingdom and name each one of them. In ancient Near Eastern culture, giving a name to something, or someone, implied the authority to define their character, to shape their nature, to fill a void with something that came from the one who gave the name. Did God intend men to behave like Him, entering boldly into whatever sphere of mystery they encountered and speaking with imagination and life-giving power into the confusion they faced? Since we fell from grace, every man's life has been filled with confusion. Let's consider just a few examples. What should a man do when his wife humiliates him in front of his friends? He must reprimand her, ignore her, say something nice, raise the topic later, telling him how you felt. Don't you ever mention it? What's a man to do when he hates his job? He must stop complaining and be grateful for a paycheck. Are you looking for another job? Accept work as a gift from God. Find out what you hate the most, and see if there is anything that can be changed. What should a man do when he is in conflict with a close friend? He must talk to your friend about it, in the spirit of Matthew 18 verses 15 and 17. Ignore him with the love that covers a multitude of sins. Call the friend's attention to his or her mistakes in an effort to promote growth. Masculinity begins to grow when a man asks questions that he knows there are no answers to. No man can escape this sphere of mystery. If you live in a relationship and have the slightest desire to make it work, you will face insoluble confusion. If man is to be fully man, he must learn what it means to move in the darkness. And that will require you to admit, I don't know what to do, with a desperation so real that no formula can help you. Recipes are useful in a well-lit kitchen. The theologian's The Magic Recipe, that collection of practical biblical principles that tell us what to do in any situation, treats confusion as something to be resolved rather than entered into. It reduces the mysteries of life to things we can handle. Prescription theologians tell us how to make life work by simplifying things and easing confusion. Transcendent theologians know that there is a darkness of confusion that we can only enter when we know Christ, when we abide in Him, when we trust Him, so that our supernatural power rises above any darkness we face. And then when we enter the darkness, with words that bring life. Once there is a commitment to delve into the darkness and mystery, the man must proceed determined to tell a good story and not remain silent. My co-authors, Don Hudson and Al Andrews, address these questions below. In Chapter 5, Don writes about the only story we men need to tell as we continue our journey, the story of God. This story reminds us that we can win, that we can continue. In Chapter 6, Al calls us to remember our own stories of how God worked in our lives, stories that bring hope, even more so, when shared in community. And in Chapter 7, Don shows us that to act like God when we are in the dark, honoring our calling to make Him known, is to break the silence and speak. And so we become men. Chapter 5. From Chaos to Chaos. The ringing of the phone divided the night in two. It took a second ring to wake him from a deep sleep. The third call made him aware of the environment around him. He looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. Who would call at that time of night? He picked up the phone in what seemed like slow motion. At the exact moment his hand grabbed the device, he hesitated. Either it's a joke or something serious is wrong. I hope it's a joke, he thought. He picked up the phone and put it to his ear. Someone was crying softly on the other end of the line. After a few intolerable seconds, he hesitantly said, "Son, this is Mom. Your father had an emergency." His mother's words left him paralyzed with disbelief. He tried to convince himself. My father is only 64 years old. He's too young for something that threatens his life. But what happens? What happened? Asked the young man. He had a heart attack while he was getting ready to go to sleep, his mother explained. I called help and, while waiting, I gave him artificial respiration. We're in the ER now and he's with the doctors. Then his tone of voice changed. He knew that tone too well. And he hated him, because he spoke to him as if he were still a little child. But, son, don't worry. We are fine and everything will be fine. True, he intoned in an expressionless voice. He ignored his mother's last sentence and said he would be on the next plane. She argued lamely, explaining that it would be a wasted trip. He hung up the phone. Images of his father and himself flashed through his mind, the two of them fighting on the ground. Fishing in the waters of the Smoky Mountains. Seeing his father cry once in his life, at his father's funeral. The night they slept together, in the hunting cabin, when he was still very little. He stopped at that particular image. He must have been about 6 years old. A wild animal roared outside the window. In less than a second he jumped onto his father's bed, got under the covers and clung to him. The world was safe with his father. What would you do without him? Enough of this, he scolded himself, I have too much to do. And Dad can recover. His older brother was waiting for him at the airport. He knew it as soon as he looked at his brother's face. His words were unnecessary, Dad is dead. He died 2 hours ago. Fulminant infarction. He then turned around and headed towards the baggage claim area. Then, turning his head, he said over his shoulder, we have much to do. Once again, the feeling of slow motion entered his life. He obediently followed his older brother as he tried to swallow the horrible truth. Standing on the conveyor belt, he began to feel his first emotions. He looked at the people passing by him. They don't know it. If they had any idea that my father was dead, they would stop. They would turn around and go home. If they knew that my father was dead, they would understand that their lives no longer have meaning. The world should stop spinning on its axis. Life should end. Why would God take him now? My 2-year-old son loves it very much. What am I going to tell him? He won't understand. I wish I could talk to my father. I wish I could pick up the phone and ask you what to do about this. He would know. But if it were? He grew angrier and angrier as thoughts flooded his mind. When he and his brother finally got to the car, he was furious. Not sad, just angry. The week of his father's funeral was an intolerable nightmare for the young man. Well-meaning people broke into the house. Some family members misbehaved. No one could say the right words. Because he was an intensely private man, each person's presence felt like an intrusion into his pain. His son asked incessantly, "Where is Grandpa?" No question provoked more despair than that. It seemed like every 30 minutes he tried to find words to explain that grandfather was in heaven. Will he be back soon? The son asked with inquisitive eyes. No, son. He won't come back. He couldn't look his wife in the eyes. From time to time he gave her an obligatory hug. He didn't allow her to comfort him. He ignored his mother as politely as possible. The day after the funeral he disappeared. Not physically. He was there, but he was just the shell of a man. In the morning he took care of the small details of the funeral home, studying his father's insurance policy and paying overdue bills. That afternoon, sitting on his parents' back porch, he became obsessed with some things that made him feel alive, like anger. I was angry. I knew this emotion well. He always felt angry, although very few people knew it. But this was more than anger. He felt violent. His wife came out to the porch and asked him if he would like to go for a walk with her. He looked at her with displeasure. In this heat? Well, we can wait until it cools down. A little, she replied. He ignored his wife's words and turned the other way. She felt alone when he picked up a magazine and began flipping through it carelessly. He felt particularly violent when someone approached him kindly. He wanted to hurt anyone who came near him. Life had dealt him a tragic blow. Someone should pay for that injustice. His anger manifested itself in a silent coldness that drove everyone away from him. But he couldn't endure such intense fury for long. In the end, his anger did nothing but remind him that he was helpless, that he was powerless in the face of this tragedy. He wanted something to help him go away or ease his pain. Something that would help him forget. So he turned to fantasies. I dreamed of other women. He indulged in lascivious thoughts. Approaching his wife at a time like this was unthinkable. He spent the afternoon idle, immersed in his wild fantasies. He sat until nightfall, and in the cool of the night he remembered. I realized that I had to prepare the sermon for the following Sunday. Sex and violence, issues that affect all men. The film and book industries generate billions of dollars from these two topics alone. Men know the power of anger. Men understand the allure of sex. When faced with the worst chaos of his life, the man in this story found solace in anger and sexual fantasy. He was furious that his father had been taken away from him so soon. Most of his friends' parents were older than him, and yet they were still alive. Why did your father die? At that time in his life, memories of his father could not ease his pain. In fact, they tormented him. They were a constant reminder of the departure of a good man to escape the pain of his father's death. He lost himself in sexual fantasies. He no longer felt the comfort of having a father to whom he could turn for advice. I was angry at being alone. Chaos, that confusing darkness that enters everyone's life, entered this man's world, and he turned to something that helped him, something that seemed natural to him. How do men usually react to chaos in their lives? Remember the story of temptation. At first, in the Garden of Eden, Adam did not know that chaos existed. The creation story in Genesis began with chaos but ended with creation. God saw everything that he had made, and, behold, it was good. He transformed the desert into a paradise and gave it to Adam and Eve to be their home. Before Adam's disobedience, man achieved success in all endeavors. There were no thorns or thistles. His work, instead of being a frustration, gave him supreme satisfaction. And, most importantly, he enjoyed perfect relationships with his wife and with God. Then, chaos once again entered history. In the culture of the time Genesis was written, the serpent was a symbol of chaos, of uncontrollable darkness. The serpent confused the word of God by questioning Eve about the wisdom of God. It has obscured the clarity of God's truth. Darkness once again loomed over the earth. A later chapter in this book explains how Adam chose silence when he was first faced with chaos. Adam's reaction to the chaos turned paradise into a desert. His silence introduced, for his descendants, a totally new chaos, violence and sexual perversion. The rest of Genesis details these stories of sex and violence, the murder of Abel, Lot's incest with his daughters, and the rape of Dinah, just to name a few. Adam's struggle and failure were repeated by all men. Our lives are full of chaos. Chaos is a tragedy dressed up in a million disguises. Could it be fear of the future? Uncertain. It is a decision that must be made when all possibilities seem right. The chaos could be the loss of a job, a pay cut, the loss of a partner, a rebellious teenager, a poor medical prognosis. If we are honest, we will admit that chaos haunts us daily. Chaos is that darkness that hangs over us every time we talk to our wives, work, pay our bills, and try to make sense of our lives. Adam taught us what not to do. Is there anything that teaches us the correct reaction to chaos in our lives? Before answering what it means to be a man, it is first necessary to decide what the reference point is. Where do men go to define themselves? Do they look at other men, at their parents, at their churches? Do they watch movies, television, psychology? Most men are defined more by the culture that surrounds them than by the truth of God's word. We must return to his revealed history if we are to be the men God intended us to be. God spoke to us through his word and gave us a wonderful plan to follow. To understand this design, we will see that it is important and useful to compare the Bible with the pagan creation stories. Let's take a quick look at how ancient cultures typically define men. What did the nations around Israel say about the men? What were their gods like? What should your men and women be like? How should they relate to each other? Although there are numerous creation accounts throughout the world, we will look at only two, one from ancient Babylon and one from ancient Greece. Just as we look to Genesis to understand ourselves, the Babylonians and Greeks turned to their myths to understand ourselves. As you read these myths, be sure to think about the creation story in Genesis. The difference between pagan myths and the Genesis story is striking. The story of the Babylonian creation. The Babylonians called her Enuma Elistai. When the heavens and the earth had no name, when there were no pastures or ponds, Apsu, fresh water, and Tiamat, salt water. They were god and goddess. They were husband and wife and had two children, Lama and Lahamu. And these had Anshar and Kishar. There were many children and grandchildren. Soon, all the children, the gods, gathered together and made a lot of noise. They were becoming more powerful and louder. This disturbed the peace and silence of his parents, Apsu and Tiamat. Apsu decided that he would murder his children and grandchildren so that silence would reign again. Tiamat was horrified. She was disgusted with her descendants but wanted to be kind to them. Apsu was not deterred. He continued to plot the downfall of his offspring. But Ea, one of his sons, found out about the sinister plan. He then cast a charm on his father, Apsu, and murdered him. Then Ea and his wife, Damkina, had a son and named him Marduk. He had 4 eyes and 4 ears. He was a splendid god, and his parents rejoiced at the power and beauty of their son. He was the greatest of all the gods. Another god, called Anu, created the 4 winds that disturbed the waters of Tiamat. Because the winds disturbed her, she, in turn, moved around day and night, disturbing the other gods. They complained about Tiamat, their mother, and blamed her for Apsu's death. Furious, she created dragons and all kinds of terrible beasts. She created demons, and they brought great chaos to the heavens. Ea called her son, Marduk, to confront Tiamat. Marduk, the great king, went out to fight Tiamat. He caused great winds to stir the waters of Tiamat. She cast magical incantations. She spat venom. He opened his mouth to devour Marduk. But Marduk blew an evil wind down her throat and then shot her an arrow. The arrow hit the goddess's heart and she died. He threw his body to the ground and stood over it, boasting of his victory. He opened his skull with his bat. He severed her arteries and let the winds carry her blood to distant places. Finally, he took his body and divided it into 2 parts. One part became heaven and the other part became earth. Marduk finished the creation. From the blood of a god he created men to serve the gods, to serve the needs of the gods. The gods rejoiced at Marduk's majesty and praised him greatly. A Greek creation story. The Greeks take their name from their creation story of the god Cronus. At first there was nothing. This nothingness was called chaos, the void. Soon the earth was born so that the gods could have something to stand on. Then came Tartarus, the underworld. So, Eros, love. He was very beautiful and the strongest of the gods. Chaos gave rise to night and Erebos. Night and Erebos gave rise to day and to space. The earth gave rise to the sky and the sea. The gods rested in the sky but inhabited Mount Olympus. Heaven and earth gave rise to the Titans. The youngest of them was Cronus. He was a wild child and hated his father, Sky. Earth and heaven had 3 more children. Each of them was a terrible and powerful monster that had 50 heads. This was too much for heaven, the father. He always hated his children and, therefore, imprisoned them in the dark regions of the earth. Her mother, Terra, conspired against her husband. He offered help to his children to escape from prison. Everyone was terrified of their father, except Cronus. His mother gave him a scythe that she had previously made. Heaven came to earth and spread tenderly over the earth. Cronus waited hidden. He hit his father with the scythe and killed him. Before he died, Zeus cursed his children. He declared that everyone would pay for the crime committed against them. Cronus had his own children. One day it occurred to him that his children could do to him the same thing that he had done to their father. If he could kill his father, then they could kill him. When his wife Rhea gave birth to his children, he ate them whole. And Rhea prayed to the earth to hide her son, Zeus. Terra granted him what he asked for by hiding Zeus in the forest. Rhea took a large stone and wrapped it. She made Cronus think that the shrouded stone was her son. Cronus grabbed the package and swallowed it. He thought he had destroyed his son. Thus, Zeus became the greatest of the gods. Logo, Zeus, would destroy his pie, Cronus. Inflamed with anger, and going crazy about the last. Both myths have points in common. Stories begin with chaos. In Babylonian myth, heaven and earth were nameless and there was no arable land. Greek history is more obvious. In the beginning there was nothing, and that was called chaos. In both stories, the male god is uncomfortable with the female goddess. She personifies chaos. She is the mystery that needs to be killed and violently dismembered. In Babylonian history, Tiamat's divided body becomes the womb that gives rise to earth and sky. In Greek history, the goddess Earth sexually seduces her husband to destroy him. The gods wage war against their own children. The gods and goddesses of pagan myths murder parents, siblings, wives, and children. They create the human race to work for them as slaves. They see humanity as evil and without any dignity. The stories end in chaos, death, destruction, sexual deviance. People are not fed, they are destroyed. Pagan myths go from chaos to chaos. Pagan myths can only affirm what is already true about men. Men are violent and sexually perverse. The pagans mold their gods in the image of man. The man as he was became his point of reference. They could only talk about what was natural for men. They rarely, if ever, spoke of what a man could become, of the dignity and beauty of masculinity. In pagan myths, men brought darkness to earth. Because the male gods were selfish, fearful, and insatiable, they brought chaos to their families. Pagan myths depicted a male god who lived for himself, a god who was the sole purpose of his own existence. Listen to what Cicero said about the Greek and Roman creation stories. The poets represented the gods inflamed by anger and maddened by lust, and exposed to our gaze their wars and battles, their fights and wounds, their hatreds, enmities and disputes. Their complaints and lamentations, the fullness and unbridledness of their passions, of their adulteries and imprisonments, of their unions with humans and the birth of mortal offspring from an immortal progenitor. In the ancient Near East, men feared chaos above all else. Ancient men lived in perpetual terror of being thrown into chaos at any moment. They lived in fear of hunger. They lived in fear of infertility. They lived in fear of marauding enemies. So what did they do with their chaos? They made gods in their image, gods of violence and sexual perversion. And they loved their gods with violence and sexual perversion to appease them, to persuade them to banish chaos from their world. This is how many men have reacted to the chaos. But how can men react to the chaos in their lives? What is the biblical norm? From chaos to creation. In the Genesis story, man is made in the image of God. Christianity begins with God, not with man. We are made in his image. He is our reference point. And who is this God? Does he resemble, in some way, the gods of pagan myths? Does God use violence and sexual perversion to confront his chaos? You are welcome. The account of creation, in Genesis, never affirms the violence of man and his demanding sexual appetite. On the contrary, history gives a rich portrait of what man was like in his perfect state and what man could be if he lived in the image of God. And man and woman, living in harmony and mutual respect. The male is not afraid of the female. The female does not try to destroy the male. They take care of each other and together they cultivate the garden in which they live. Adam and Eve were to cultivate and preserve the garden. That is, they were called to protect and nourish. Strength, the opposite of violence, is in man to protect relationships, not to destroy them. Intimacy, the opposite of lust, is in man to nurture people, not to use them for his selfish desires. Adam's first recorded words were relational and poetic. This, indeed, is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Throughout Genesis and the Old Testament, man is the mediator. He it is the connection between the past and the future. Understand that it does not live for itself. Do not destroy your children. Do not forget your children. Know that violence destroys children. He remembers the old stories, the stories of his parents and grandparents. And he lives to transfer the story of God to the next generation, to his children and grandchildren. When the children ask him in the future, these words and ordinances that God has given him ordained, what do they mean? Then you will tell your children. 6. Deuteronomy 6, 20, 21. There is an important similarity between Genesis and pagan myths. It is recorded in Genesis 3, the fall of man. Adam's disobedience did exactly what pagan myths tolerated. God went from chaos to creation in Genesis 1 and 2. In Genesis 3, Adam went from chaos to chaos in a world of beauty. Adam's disobedience set in motion a dark world. A world of sex and violence. The rest of Genesis portrays the results of the first man's sin: hatred, murder, racism, rape, incest, and adultery. When man enters the mystery of life with fury and lust, he lives as the pagans live. He thinks there is no hope in God. God is absent. God is silent. Man does not know what to do with the confusion in his life, so he seeks rage and lust. Anger makes a man feel powerful. Violence causes us to take matters into our own hands and seek to correct an unjust God. Lust helps man to forget. Fantasy is a selfish way of living in the present. She denies the pain of the past and the hope of the future. With anger, men are present but dangerous. With lust, the men are absent, but they feel alive. The book of Genesis tells a very different story of creation. Yes, the story ends badly. But it begins with great beauty. That is our hope. Beauty exists. Meaning and order exist. Reacting to the mystery of life with violence and sexual perversion returns the world to darkness. Genesis never approves of this. Genesis invites us to return to our design, to become men of strength and intimacy, to honor our calling to be like God. The book of Revelation tells us that one day we will achieve it. Everything between these two books tells us how. This is the story of God. She needs to be remembered. Chapter 6. A call to remember. Before entering the windowless building, he looked both ways, as if he were about to cross a dangerous intersection. His heart was racing with both fear and fear. I was afraid of being caught. Or not get caught. He felt the thrill of being awake and taking risks. Although this part of the city was one that his parishioners rarely visited, he was worried about the possibility that someone he knew would see him passing by at that moment. But seeing no familiar faces, he cautiously walked past a door marked "Adults Only." For the next hour, he flipped through magazines and watched videos avidly, occasionally glancing up to ensure his anonymity. During that time he forgot everything he considered important: the rich hours of prayer he had enjoyed with good friends the night before, the wife, pregnant with the second child of the marriage, the bright-eyed 2-year-old daughter, the constantly growing church that he shepherded, the God he had known since his conversion in high school. He put everyone out of his mind, because their presence would have spoiled the momentary indulgence. After a while, he left as cautiously as he had entered, feeling bored and excited at the same time. Tired and deeply dissatisfied. During the long drive home, the initial fear and excitement of their adventure was replaced by a familiar feeling of defeat. On the other side of town, another man was heading to the same place. This was also a path he visited frequently. But this time, during his winding journey, he noticed an ancient stone cathedral situated along his route. Suddenly, he made a decision. He drove the car to the church parking lot. He stopped, got out and walked towards the huge oak doors. Like the other man, he was scared and excited, but he didn't need to look both ways before entering. This man's fear was that his sudden choice, a better and different choice, was short-lived. But, perhaps, there was something noble within him, something that inspired his choice, something that pressed for release. He went through the doors. Once inside, he walked silently towards the altar. There he lit a candle, knelt before it and prayed. He felt humiliated and broken by the foolish decisions he had made in the past, and grateful that something was different that day. He thought of his wife, his children, his colleagues in the ministry, and he remembered God and worshipped him there. After a while he left the church, got into the car and went home. He was exhausted from the fight. But for the first time in many years he felt hopeful. The fight is real. You have just read two short stories about two men. Their struggles are similar, your choices are not. In these stories, many men may recognize their own struggles with similar issues. Dozens of men have fought embarrassing battles like this for years, but they are ashamed to talk about them to anyone. They felt alone. Other men who don't struggle with pornography may not be aware of more subtle addictions. They indulge in different passions: overwork, materialism, gluttony, the need to control, the need to please, an active life of fantasies, masturbation. The list is endless, but the struggle is the same. All men struggle with irresistible desires and passions that defy restrictions. And like the two men in the stories that began this chapter, some fight well, while others know only defeat. The root of the problem. If one of these two men came to you asking for help, what would you say to them? What advice would you give that would help you face your problems? Most counselors, perhaps, would go in one of several directions. You need to be in fellowship with other believers, some will say. If you fellowship with godly men and women, you are more likely to stay away from sinful patterns. Being responsible to someone. Read the Bible and memorize key passages, suggests another. The man who keeps the word of God in his heart will not allow himself to be trapped by the things of this world. Still another will advise: escape from temptation. Stay away from certain places that could trip you. All of this advice is good, solid and correct. All have strong biblical support. For some men, these exhortations have produced palpable changes. But many others are even more discouraged by this advice. Maybe that's your reaction. Maybe you've been faithfully doing all of these things for years and nothing has really changed. You have temporary successes, but your problems keep coming back, and you end up feeling more discouraged than ever. I suggest we consider another approach to men's struggles, one that incorporates the good from other advice and offers more. Instead of simply mustering more energy to do, or not do something, look deeper. Ask yourself, why do we do what we do? Why do we choose to live in ways contrary to what we know to be true and right? Men are created in the image of God. By design, we are called to express, by the way we live and relate to each other in a unique way, something of Him, with the world. We were made to move, speak, create, love. If our lives do not reflect this image, something is wrong. And what is wrong here is serious. A big choice is required of men, one that encompasses much more than the decision of whether or not to watch pornography. Wrong choice, when not recognized, results in the violation of man's essential nature. Deviating from the design planned by us is the root of the problem. And this separation is always a choice. Created to remember. We have already seen that man expresses the image of God when he moves and speaks to the chaos of his world. However, there is more involved in God's design for men. Genesis 1 verse 27 explicitly tells us that God created man and woman in his image. In this passage, the word man. It is translated from the Hebrew word zakar, which means he who remembers. What a curious word to describe the man. Perhaps we were expecting a word that meant he who is strong, he who leads, or he who is powerful. But instead, the man is described as someone who remembers. Because, what should a man remember? Should you remember better where you left your keys? Should you try harder to remember important dates, such as wedding anniversaries and birth dates? If this is what it means to be a man, one who remembers, so all but the most compulsive of us are in trouble. But the idea of memory has a much deeper meaning. First, it means that we have something important to remember. Second, it suggests that we have a reason to remember. Something to remember. We all have many lifelong friends who have shared important moments in our lives. For me, these friends were my colleagues in a campus ministry. It has been many years since we last met, but every time this group of dear friends gets together, each of us knows what will happen. We'll enjoy a good meal, catch up on each other's lives, and finally, At some point during the evening, we'll start telling stories. This part is not something we discuss beforehand, nor is it something each of us prepares for. It just happens. Someone begins to remember a particular event from our shared past and everyone listens intently. It's a story that every man in the group has heard countless times, but that doesn't reduce the interest in storytelling. In fact, we are so familiar with each story that the narrator is often corrected by someone who remembers some important part of the plot. Anticipation builds as the story gains momentum and builds toward the fun climax. When that moment comes, we all burst into laughter and tears stream down our faces as we try to catch our breath. And when we regained our composure, we heard a request, "Understood, tell us about." And the cycle continues well into the night. Why do we tell these stories? Is it because we are desperate to have fun? Some have already suggested this. Is it because we live in the past and cannot move forward? Some have also suggested this. But there is a much more important reason. The problem has nothing to do with the stories we tell. In themselves, they are nothing more than fun vignettes of shared lives. They are fun and sometimes silly, but somehow they are important. Their value lies in the power they have to point us in the direction of something. They remind us of other days, other times, years ago, when we worked together in a student ministry. It was a moment in which we saw God work in our lives and in the lives of the students for whom we were responsible. Important things happened, sad things happened, real miracles happened. God did a work among us and we tell our stories to remember those days. It is appropriate for our group of men to tell stories to each other. After all, men were built that way. We are those who remember, created to remember the past, created to tell stories. Remembering is a theme that recurs throughout the Bible. When God's people gathered to worship, they confessed their sins and prayed, and one of their leaders stood up among them and began to remember the works of God. You saw the suffering of our ancestors in Egypt and heard their cry at the Red Sea. You performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his officials and against all the people of his land, because they knew how arrogantly the Egyptians treated them. You achieved renown, which remains to this day. You divided the sea before them, so that they crossed it on dry land, but you threw their pursuers into the depths, one with a stone into troubled waters. You guided them by day with a cloud, and at night with a pillar of fire, to light the way they had to go. The story was told and repeated as the episodes were remembered. Think about how many times God's works are recounted in the Bible. Why so many times? In the Old Testament, God was eager to reveal himself to a people living in chaos. The elders knew that stories of God's faithful love were a necessary anchor for the people to continue trusting. His telling of ancient stories conveyed a vital message: God is faithful to his people. Time and time again, he has intervened on our behalf. He demonstrated his goodness. And he is, today, the same God as then. So cheer up. Have faith. Do not forget what he is like and what he has done. Habakkuk, the prophet who rails against God for his apparent inactivity and accuses him of being deaf and dumb, finds hope when he remembers and prays, "Lord, I have heard of your fame. I tremble at your actions, Lord. Do it again, in our time, the same works, make them known in our time. Dust, in your anger, remember mercy." Acts 3:2. Habakkuk was remembering the revealed history of God. Once, when the Philistines approached Israel to fight, the prophet Samuel offered a sacrifice. The Lord thundered and spread panic among the enemies, allowing Israel to defeat them with ease. Then Samuel took a stone and set it down, and called it Ebenezer, which means, "The Lord has helped us up to this point." From that day on, every time the people passed by that stone, they were reminded of God's faithfulness. We are the ones who remember. We were created to remember the words of God and the work of God. Men are called to remember God by faithfully telling others who he is and what he has done. But why? What is the purpose of memory? A reason to remember. Just be careful. Be very careful so that you never forget the things that your eyes have seen. Keep them in your memory all your life. Tell them their children and their grandchildren. Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when the Lord said to me, "Gather the people before me to hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me as long as they live in the land, and teach them to their children." Deuteronomy 4, 9, 10. A few years ago I went through a particularly difficult time. For months, everything in my life seemed like a battle. My counseling ministry clients presented especially complicated and seemingly intractable problems. My friends were going through extremely difficult times. The horrors of living in this fallen world seemed very close. I started to feel a little unbalanced. At all times I felt an irrepressible desire to cry or fight. I heard a song on the radio and started crying. A driver was drifting a little into my lane, and I had to resist the urge to run him off the road. A boy sitting in his mother's shopping cart in a supermarket smiled at me and my eyes filled with tears. However, if the checkout line didn't move fast enough, I immediately went to the manager. Furious, to correct the problem. Sadness and fury, coming and going. Finally, I contacted a good friend and colleague and told him what was going on. He listened attentively before giving me this solemn response: "It is difficult to have gone into battle and discovered that there is no way out." His answer stunned me, but I knew it was the truth. Over the course of several years, I made some decisions to fight a bigger battle. I had chosen to open my eyes, more and more, to the terrible realities of a fallen world. When I was in my early 20s, I lived as a man who was content to let others fight the big battles, while I stayed behind the scenes and offered food and water. But that position was changing and I knew it. Facing the future now seemed terrifying. Its reality brought me tears and anger. Tears, because I wanted to go home, wherever it was. And anger, for what I feared was to come, and for what might be demanded of me. After talking to my friend, I remembered some stories my father told me about World War II, which he had fought in when he was young. One night I called my father and asked him to write me some of his reflections on his experience in the war. The following week my father's letter arrived. He eloquently described the days leading up to the Omaha Beach invasion. The feelings of men. The words of their commanders. Landing on the beaches. Crawling under the bodies of fallen comrades. Fatigue. Difficulty. The cause that gave him courage and the fear that drove him to retreat. And, interspersed with the entire description of the battle, my father's words spoke of prayer, of fear, of knowing God in the midst of terrible and difficult times. I devoured the letter. She made me discover a part of my father that I had not known before. But the most important thing is that she gave me hope. Something about him, something about what I remembered, had been passed on to me. And now he knew in a deeper way something of the ways of God. My friend's words and my father's letter suggest why we should remember. Men are called to transmit something important to future generations, not only to transmit history, but to transmit the memory of God in our lives. It is the act of putting our present life into a broader perspective. In fact, the psalmist testifies to the hope and value that the stories of Israel gave him. With our own ears we hear, "O God, our ancestors told us of the deeds you performed in time. Of them in the days of yore. With your own hand you drove out the nations to establish our fathers. You ruined peoples and made our ancestors prosper. It was not I nor with the sword with which they conquered the land, nor with the strength of their arms that achieved victory. It was by your right hand, by your arm, and with the light of your face. Use, therefore, your love towards them." Psalm 44 verses 1 and 3. My father did not give me the answers to my struggle. But your memory gave me courage to continue in the midst of it. Your stories gave me hope. The refusal to remember. Most men are known for their silence. Children rarely learn about their parents' past, their experiences, their failures, their struggles with faith. Instead of passing on something to his children, he remains silent, acting as if he has no memory. Because. Think again about the two men I described at the beginning of this chapter. How does the idea of man as he who remembers relate to the fight against sexual sin, or any other sin? Think about it. The man who entered the adults-only store had to forget everything he loved. He could not enjoy those sinful pleasures while he still had any thoughts about wife, children, or ministry in his mind. During those moments, however brief they were, he also had to put God out of his mind to honor his sinful decisions. Consider a time when you moved intentionally, physically or mentally. Did something he knew was wrong? At that time, what was your relationship with God like? Was it close? Were you enjoying his intimacy? Of course. If God had been present, you could not have continued in that sinful direction. This is the nature of idolatry, the search for something other than God to satisfy one's desires. Sinful decisions require that God be forgotten. In this sense, forgetting means more than simply not knowing where the car keys are. It is an active and determined choice. A refusal to remember. The Apostle Paul vividly describes what happened. When men exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made in the likeness of mortal man, and of birds, and of four-footed animals, and of reptiles, Romans 1 verse 23. Therefore God gave you over to sexual impurity, according to the sinful desires of your heart, to the degradation of your body among you, Romans 1 verse 24. Verse 28 is especially worthy of our attention. Moreover, because they despised the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a reprehensible disposition of mind, to do what they ought not to do. These people have forgotten God. The result was a serious sin. Although men knew the truth about God, they reached a point where they saw no value in keeping that truth at the forefront of their minds. They created predictable gods, gods who would not interfere with their sinful decisions. What does a man do when he goes to a bookstore or when he fantasizes about something? What happens when you need to be in control and demand that others align with your way of thinking? What is a man's motivation when his greatest passion is to please people? In each of these situations, the underlying problem is not believing that God is enough. This life I'm living isn't working. God is not treating me as I deserve. Life just doesn't feel good to me. I want something or someone that makes me feel good or controls me. Trusting God is not producing the results I want. Therefore, I will leave it aside. We must choose to forget about God for a while and replace him with something more pleasant. Men come to this very naturally. Adam, before the fall, had something to remember. Adam knew a lot about God's character, from witnessing God's creative work and from his conversations with him. Adam knew what God had given him to do, what God had provided for him, and what his own limits were. However, we have already seen that Adam did not act on what he knew to be true. When the serpent tempted Eve, Adam did not speak. His memory failed. To be more precise, he refused to remember. Am I suggesting that men should set up a story time for their families every night? That every time man is tempted he must recite biblical passages that recount the works of God? Do these things really help? Maybe. But they can only put more pressure on the man to do the right thing. Something more is needed, a change of mind. Unless men honestly confront their stubborn delight in forgetfulness and their dedication to passions stronger than their desire for God, lasting change will never occur. A call to remember. When I was a new Christian, I thought it was incredible that a group of people who had witnessed the parting of the Red Sea could forget what God had done and go back to worshipping false gods. Shortly after their miraculous deliverance at the hands of the Egyptians, the Israelites were once again committing sin. And the Bible recounts dozens of incidents throughout Israel's history in which people knew the goodness of God but still sought other ways of life. These stories used to surprise me. But today, when I face the realities of my own life, it no longer surprises me. I am a man who believes, a man who has seen the hand of God working mightily in my life. And yet, sometimes, I still look for something more than God to give me satisfaction and fulfillment. And in doing so, I can't remember what is true. After 3 years, Jesus' time with the disciples was coming to an end. One night, Jesus gathered them together for the Passover meal. This group of men had been with him, had seen his miracles with their own eyes, and would soon witness his death and resurrection. To these men Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me." Surely, of all people, they would not need a symbol to help them remember Christ. After everything they had witnessed and heard, how could they forget it? However, Jesus knew these men as he knows us. And he knew his inclination to forget. Consider the small argument, recorded in Luke 22 verse 24, that occurred between them shortly after Jesus predicted his death. A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was considered the greatest. Even before Jesus left their presence, they had forgotten what he had said. They were already moving away from the life to which Jesus had called them. The two men described at the beginning of this chapter were faced with the choice of remembering. They both fought. And they both loved it. The first refused to remember and finally worshipped before the altar of a false god. The second, hearing Christ's call to remember him, worshipped the true God. Chapter 7. He was there, and he was silent. I believe in God even when he is silent. That had been the longest day of his week. He was a professor at a small university and had to work 2 jobs to balance the family budget. He got up very early that Wednesday morning to advise a client from another city by phone. Then, he ran to a student to have breakfast together. He then hurried to his office for the weekly faculty meeting. As soon as the meeting was over, he gave a 3-hour class. Then came lunch with another student, followed by 4 consecutive hours of counseling. To end the day, he spent an hour with a colleague discussing plans for an upcoming seminar. Driving home that night, I was exhausted and worn out. I had spoken with friends, students, alumni, colleagues and clients from 5:30 in the morning until 6:30 in the afternoon. Once again, he had given himself to the point of exhaustion. While still on his way home, he came to the conclusion that he had nothing left of himself to give to anyone. More than anything, he wanted to be alone. He thought briefly about how he could escape for a few days. While listening to the radio, he dreamed of his imaginary cabin nestled in the mountains. No controversy. No requests. No criticism. But he was torn by another thought that, although pleasant, gnawed at him. As tired as he was, he couldn't wait to be with the people he loved most, his wife and son. As he approached the garage, he felt a rage rising inside him. His body tensed and he felt a familiar wall rise. He knew exactly what would happen when he entered the house. He replayed the scene in his mind as he pulled into the garage. His son would want to play and his wife would want to know everything about his day. And she would want to tell everything about the day she had had. She would give him a list of everything she had faced since he left that morning. I would ask him to take a look at the clothes dryer or fix the toilet or unclog the garbage disposal. Remaining seated in the car, he felt the weight of what his family would ask of him. He began to blame his wife for his anger and frustration. She asks too much. She doesn't understand the frustrations of my job. She doesn't appreciate the sacrifices I make for her. She never gives me a break, he complained to himself. When he entered the room, the wife greeted him with a question that millions of wives ask their husbands every day. It was a simple question that only required a simple answer. Why did that make him angry? His wife didn't ask him for something he couldn't give her, like the answer to a complex math problem, for example. She was asking for something he could give her, but which he guarded like a deranged pirate guards his most secret treasure. She asked, "How was your day, Dot?" He had spent his long day talking, advising, chatting, teaching, discussing future plans. And now, after 13 hours of conversations, he offered his wife his customary answer to that question. Looking her directly in the eyes, he said a single word, Good. I hoped that would end the conversation. He immediately picked up the mail and pretended that the wife's question was more urgent. He, however, was fully aware that she was asking him more than how his day had been. She wanted him to share his life with her, to start a conversation, to touch her loneliness with his words and his presence. But he refused to do this. Like so many nights before, he remained silent before the one he loved. He could talk to students and clients, but he hid from his wife. Later that night, in the privacy of his mind, he agonized over her stubborn, silent escape. And he asked himself the usual questions. Why do I despise your questions? I love my wife, but I use tiredness as an excuse to write her off. Why did I remain silent? Today has been an especially long day. But even on the easiest days, I run away from those I love. Because what happens to men? I understand this, man. I understand this because, almost every day, I follow this same routine and ask myself the same questions. However, my work, both in the scriptures and in my counseling practice, has convinced me that every man struggles with a profound and chosen silence. The first time I taught about men's silence, I found myself surrounded by a group of wives exclaiming, "My husband is silent too. What can I do to make him talk to me?" And some men crept up and whispered, "I thought I was the only one. Do you have problems with this too?" Every man struggles with the tension between a design he cannot escape and his daily violation of that design. The design of every man is to speak and be the target of the speech of others. Men want to love and be loved, but they feel blocked inside. Something is not allowing your emotions and feelings to come out. Can we receive help? Can we change? Of course, but the godly man's journey begins in a strange way. Your journey begins when you face failure, no, when you achieve success. It starts with an honest assessment of what is wrong. Solving a problem always begins with a correct evaluation of the problem. We need to clearly understand what is happening to us before we can change and live our lives. The scriptures offer an explanation. They talk about a man, the first man there was. The problem of silence. Let's take a closer look at this well-known story to see what the problem is and where it lies. Started. Adam was there. And the snake was the most sagacious of all wild animals that the Lord God had made. And the serpent said to the woman, God actually said, "You shall not eat of all the trees in the garden." Dark. And the woman answered the serpent, "Can you eat the fruit of the trees of the garden? But of the fruit of the tree that is standing in the middle of the garden, God actually said that you could not eat it, and it was not you can touch it, so as not to die." He said to the woman, "You certainly will not die. For God knows that in the day you eat, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and that it was desirable to have wisdom, and she took some of its fruit and ate it. And she also gave it to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. And the eyes of both of them were opened, and they saw that they were naked, and they were sewing together fig leaves and making garments. Throughout history, the church has generally blamed Eve for the fall of the human race. Most people assume that while the serpent and Eve were talking, Adam was somewhere else. They suppose that, after having sinned, Eve found Adam and induced him to eat the forbidden fruit. Eve is often accused of having attempted to wage a battle of wits with the serpent and, in her weakness, succumbing to her opponent's cunning. It has been taught that Eve took the first step in sinning against God, and that Adam simply followed her example. Some interpreters have even suggested that Adam ate the fruit so that Eve would not live alone in her sin. In fact, they make Adam appear noble in light of the petulance of his weaker vessel. But what would happen if Adam was there with Eve during the entire conversation? What if he stood next to her and heard for himself the snake twisting and turning around the truth? What if his disobedience began not when he ate the fruit, but when he refused to speak to the snake or his wife? If Adam was present and remained silent, this sheds new light on the trouble with men. The Church's interpretation of Genesis may have allowed men to blame women for their problems, just as Adam blamed Eve, and not take responsibility for their failures. But the situation changes radically if Adam was present, next to Eve, while the serpent tempted her. Then your silence becomes a sin, with far-reaching implications. There are 4 reasons why we believe that Adam was present at the temptation. His silence fits the immediate context of Genesis 1 verse 3. Genesis 3 verse 6 says that he was there. The style of the entire narrative recorded in Genesis 3 verses 1 and 7 suggests that Eve immediately turned to Adam and bore fruit to him, and other men in Genesis experienced this ancient problem of Adam's silence, suggesting that his silence became a pattern for his male descendants. Adam, the image bearer. First, let's look at the immediate context of this passage. We will do this by comparing Genesis 3 with Genesis 1. In Genesis 1, God faces darkness and chaos. The earth was without form and void. We saw earlier that God created the world in a unique way. He spoke in darkness and generated order, beauty, and relationship. The Jewish community has a different expression to describe this creator. He who spoke and the world was born. He is a God who uses language to establish relationships. He does not shrink from darkness and chaos within it. And after his creative activity, he keeps the Sabbath. In Genesis 3, Adam, the man who was supposed to represent God, acts very differently from his God. As in Genesis 1, the story of Genesis 3 begins with chaos, and the serpent was the most cunning of all the wild animals that the Lord God had made. She said to the woman, "This is exactly what God said." We noted, in chapter 5, that the snake represented chaos. People of the ancient Near East believed that the snake symbolized deception and confusion. In Genesis 3 verse 1, chaos reappears in the form of a serpent that uses deception to confuse Adam and Eve. But what happens in the face of chaos? Ironically, Eve reflects the image of God to you more clearly than Adam because she is the one who speaks to the serpent. But what about Adam? If Adam was there, he didn't say anything. Chaos had entered his perfect world and he stood stunned in its confusion and darkness. The scriptures do not record instructions from God to Adam about what to say to the serpent. That's why Adam didn't say anything. Adam was, therefore, a silent man, a passive man. Like many men in history, he was physically present but emotionally absent. It fades into the background of history instead of taking center stage and foreground. In contrast, God appeared, front and center of the scene in Genesis 1, and spoke with the purpose of transforming a desert into a paradise. Adam, however, disappeared. His sin began with his silence. It was designed to speak, but it said nothing. He listened to the snake, listened to his wife, accepted the fruit and then ate it. Adam was passive 3 times before eating the forbidden fruit. The word of God lifted creation from chaos. Adam's silence returned chaos to creation. Remember that God used language to establish relationships. Adam used silence to destroy relationships. God rested after of his creative work. Adam worked harder as a result of his silence. Adam ruined paradise because he didn't do something. Adam, the image bearer of God, did not reflect his God because he chose to be absent, silent, and forgotten from the order of God. Adam, who was with her. There is a second basis for believing that Adam was present during the temptation. The text explicitly states that Adam was there, and the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasing to the eye, and that it was desirable to give wisdom, and she took of its fruit and ate it. And her husband also gave, who was with her, and he with me. Genesis 3:6, translation and emphasis by the author. Now, this simple and damning phrase has been largely ignored, and it shouldn't be. It is an important phrase. In Hebrew, the word imha 7 is composed of 2 others, whose translation into Portuguese would be equivalent to with her. The Hebrew construction is a combination of the preposition im, meaning with, and the third-person feminine personal pronoun ha-8, meaning she. When im is used in the Hebrew Bible, it denotes close proximity between the interlocutors, to the point of having sexual relations. Other prepositions could have been chosen to show association in this verse, but the use of im indicates not only a very close association, but also physical proximity. A good translation of this phrase would be, there with her. Many verses confirm this interpretation of the phrase, who was with her. Consider just one, Judges 13 verse 9. This verse appears in the story of Samson, which is told in Judges 13 verse 16. Before Samson was born, the angel of the Lord appeared to his mother. Now, typically, the angel of the Lord appeared to men. Why then, this time, did he appear to Samson's mother and not to Manoah, his father? Samson's mother was barren and the angel of the Lord appeared to promise her a son. He said she should consecrate her son as a Nazirite, a man who should never cut your hair. The woman ran to tell her husband about the angel's appearance and announcement, but Manoah doubted the story. He asked the Lord to come again and tell him what to do with the child. Perhaps he did not trust the woman's word, or, perhaps, he was slow to understand what the Lord had already said. In any case, the Lord answered Manoah's prayer, but not exactly in the way I had requested. Listen to the Bible story. God heard the voice of Manoah, and the angel of God came again to the woman as she sat on the bed, but Manoah her husband was not with her. Judges 13 verse 9. Translation and author's emphasis. Here we see the same phrase, imha, again, only this time it is used with the negative. In Judges 13, the angel of the Lord appears to the woman, but her husband, Manoah, is literally lo imha, not with her. He is not physically present. In Genesis 3, the serpent appears, talks to another woman, and Adam, her husband, is imha, right there with her. Thus we see this Hebrew word used in two significant examples. In both cases, the meaning clearly involves physical proximity. Manoah was not there with his wife, but Adam was there. With these scriptures clearly stated, the burden of proof falls on the traditional interpretation to prove that Adam was not with Eve. The text indicates that he was. Eve turned towards her husband. The third reason we believe Adam was there is because Genesis 3:17 is the narrative of a single unit of time. Nothing in this passage indicates a gap in time between the time Eve ate the fruit and the time she offered it to Adam. And there is nothing in verse 6 to suggest that Adam was distant at the time of temptation. There is also no evidence that Eve ate the fruit alone and then went to find Adam. If we read the narrative as it is presented to us, we will never see any interruption in time in verse 6. Instead, we see Eve taking the fruit and biting into it, and immediately giving it to her passive and silent husband, who was with her. Once again, the burden of proof falls on the traditional interpretation to show that there was a pause in time between Eve eating the fruit and then leaving the scene to find Adam. Adam, time after time. The author of Genesis is a storyteller. He revealed the plot and problem in the first 3 chapters. The rest of the 47 chapters develop the same theme in countless fascinating stories. Like everything good in history, Genesis repeats these same themes and events. And the theme of male silence appears again and again. Many of the men portrayed in Genesis choose to remain silent and distant, absent and distracted. And they continually get into trouble, each time they choose silence instead of getting involved, or forgetting instead of remembering. For example, Abram, later called Abraham, instead of trusting God's timing, heeded Sarai's suggestion and slept with her servant, Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Look, the Lord has prevented me from having children. Please go to my servant, so that I can obtain children through her." And Abraham heard the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her Egyptian maid, and gave her to Abram her husband to wife. Genesis 16 verses 2 and 3, Translation and emphasis by the author. Notice the similarities between Adam and Abraham. Like Adam, Abraham was passive when interacting with his wife. Even though Sarah was wrong, Abraham listened to her. Remember, God punished Adam for listening to his wife. And just as Eve gave the forbidden fruit to her husband, so Sarah gave her servant to Abraham, and he took her. Abraham remained silent and passive. And his silence still speaks, 4,000 years later. Ishmael, son of Hagar, whose descendants make up the Arab nations, despises Israel to this day. Let's consider another example. Lot decided to stay away from the notorious sin of Sodom, a city that was the epitome of evil. Lot even offered his daughters to a group of perverted rapists. Their action is not much different from that of Abraham and Isaac, who put their wives at risk by offering them to foreign kings. They are examples of what many men are like today. They are weak men, who sacrifice the women in their lives out of cowardice. Like Adam, these men force their wives into chaos for them. Like Noah, they harm their children for years, even generations, with their drunkenness. In his drunken stupor, Lot did not know that he was having sexual relations with his own daughters. His drunkenness led him to incest, which produced children, who then continually waged war against Israel. Perhaps the most illuminating story for us is told in Genesis 38. It is a dark and generally ignored story, but it deserves careful observation because it recreates the story of the first sin. Judah went to Canaan in search of a wife. He married a woman named Sua, and she bore him 3 children. She conceived and gave birth to a son, and named him She conceived and gave birth to a son, whom she named Onan. Once again she gave birth to a son and named him Selam. Genesis 38, 3, 5. Translation by the author. Clearly, Judah had no difficulty in fulfilling the divine command to multiply and replenish the earth. But like all the other Genesis stories, chaos entered the picture. Judah's firstborn was evil in God's sight, and God killed him. The second son, Onan, was ordered to practice a levirate form of marriage to care for his dead brother's wife, Tamar, and carry on the family name. But Onan knew that the children would not be his, nor the inheritance. So, instead of doing what God asked of him, Onan spilled his semen on the ground. In doing so, he refused to perpetuate the memory of his brother, and also his father, Judah. In essence, he refused to remember. And what was God's reaction to this lapse of memory? He also took Onan's life. Now, put yourself in Judah's place, like your father before him, desperately wanting a son to carry your memory and your name. And he realizes that God's promise to Abraham is, as always, just 1 generation away from being erased. In short, having no children means having no promises. This is why children were so important to the early Hebrew families. If they did not have children, God's promise would be broken. You had 3 children, but you lost your firstborn, the one in whom you placed your greatest hope. And now you give your second son to your brother's wife so that she may have children. And he dies too. The question for you is, will he also give away his 3rd child, his last hope? Will you trust God with chaos like this? Judah did not trust. And the author of Genesis tells the truth about him. Then Judah said to Tamar his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, because he too must die." Like his brothers, Judah was afraid. He was the chosen one. The 3rd child was their last hope. If she had trusted in God, Judah would have given birth to her 3rd son. But instead, he was paralyzed by the chaos. He treated Tamar with condescension and simply put the problem aside. Tragedy awaits those who are silent. What happens when men forget God and remain silent? What is the result when you refuse to act sacrificially in response to God's promise? Tragically, they invite others into the chaos of their world. Chaos for Judah was the unpredictable future. What would happen to his 3rd child if he gave him to Tamar? The uncertainty of the future paralyzed Judah. Maybe he thought that firing Tamar would make the problem go away. But the problem returned. His weakness and deception found him. Listen to the rest of the story. Judah's wife died. After the time of mourning had passed, she went to another city to shear her sheep. When it was said to Tamar, "Your father-in-law is going to Timnath to shear his sheep," she changed her widow's clothes, covered herself, and put on a veil himself to disguise himself, and went to sit at the entrance to Enaim. He was on his way to Timnath. He did this because he saw that Shelah, although she was already older, had not been given to him in marriage. Genesis 38:13-14. Judah had not kept his promise to offer his last son as Tamar's husband. But Tamar, not being the passive woman that many people in the church value today, was willing to solve the problem. She showed more concern for continuing Abraham's lineage than Judah's. Judah saw Tamar and thought she was a prostitute. Another man, in Genesis, oblivious to the reality that surrounded him. He slept with Tamar without knowing who she was, and continued on his way. 3 months later, Judah learned that Tamar was pregnant. As a man of justice, he became enraged and ordered his daughter-in-law to be burned for not having been faithful. But Tamar, unlike her mother Eve, did something shrewd in response to this man's weakness. Because Judah had mistaken Tamar for a prostitute, he had asked her for sexual favors. Tamar had accepted, but had demanded that Judah give her his seal, his cord, and his staff. One scholar commented that these things would be the modern equivalent of Judah's driver's license and credit cards. In a brilliant move, Tamar set the trap for her father-in-law. Eve's daughter reversed Eve's disobedience. Eve stopped using her wits to defeat the serpent. Tamar used her brilliant intelligence to fulfill the cultural mandate. Tamar fulfilled her role until the right moment. As a helpless woman, she had to condemn a strange but powerful man. According to Judah's order, they would take her away to burn her. On the way, he said to his executioners, "Oh, by the way, the owner of this seal, cord and staff, he is the father of my son." Judah was left with no way out. He had to admit the truth. After lying to Tamar for years, finally answered honestly, "This Midher is more righteous than I." And how did God respond to this? He responded by blessing Tamar with twin sons. Judah's silence, alienation, and deception forced Tamar into the uncertainty of her world. His silence was a denial of God, because he did not trust God with his future. It was Judah's stubborn paralysis that threatened his descendants. He thought that protecting his interests would save his last son. But I was wrong. If it were not for Tamar, the promise of God would have died with the last son of Judah. If it weren't for Tamar, David would not have existed. If it weren't because of Tamar, Christ would not have existed. In this story, Judah had a short-sighted and selfish view. It was Tamar who invited Judah to a broader, more selfless vision. Like Adam, Abraham, and Lot, Judah did not understand the far-reaching consequences of his actions. His silence impacted generations of humanity. The New Testament commemorates Tamar's courage and cunning by including her in the genealogy of Christ in Matthew, record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah begat Perez and Zerah with Tamar. Matthew 1:1-3, author's translation. Adam was not alone in his silence. He was a man not unlike us. Chaos entered his world and he decided to forget. He was passive. He chose silence and remained absent. His decision to remain silent set the pattern of men's disobedience ever since. Adam Keller. Adam was not only silent with the serpent, but he was also silent with Eve. He never reminded him of the word of God. He never called her to a broader vision. He did not join his wife in facing the snake's wits. He listened passively when she spoke, rather than speaking to her out of mutual respect. I am not saying that Adam should have spoken for Eve, or for her, as a father speaks to his son or as a superior speaks to an inferior. Many men make this mistake. I am also not suggesting that men should speak up and women should keep their mouths shut. Both men and women are created in the image of God to speak. This is exactly where the first man sinned. Adam disobeyed by not speaking to the serpent and his wife. He was absent and passive. His silence was the symbol of his refusal to get involved with Eve. And God punished Adam for his silence, and he declared to the man, "Since you listened to your wife, and ate the fruit of the tree of which I commanded her not to eat, cursed will be the earth because of her. You will feed on suffering him every day of your life." Genesis 3:17. God punished Adam for eating the forbidden fruit. But she also punished him for listening to his wife. The Adam's disobedience was a process. Adam was silent and then ate from the tree. His disobedience did not begin when he ate, but when he remained silent. Disobeying God was the result of distancing himself from his wife. It was a silent man who finally broke God's explicit commandment. The silence, it's lethal. Like every man, I remain silent like Adam. Sometimes I am horrified by my confusion. When my wife asks me to share even a small part of myself, I usually cringe. Sometimes when she cries, I get angry with her. Your tears scare me, because I don't know what to do with them. When he says I did something wrong, I defend myself to the last desperate degree. If she finds something wrong with me, I find 10 things bad about her. I refuse to be wrong. I use words, I talk, but I use words to destroy the relationship, like the snake did in the garden. However, if my wife could penetrate beyond the surface of my anger, she would discover that I am ashamed of what I have inside of me. What happens if I share my most intimate thoughts, dreams and doubts and she rejects me? Remember my story. I am a man who feels like an imposter. I assume that I have nothing to offer. It is better, I mistakenly deduce, to hide behind my silence. But silence is not golden, it is lethal. Adam's silence was lethal. It caused the breakup of the relationship. And in the end it brought death. What does my silence do to my wife? He points the finger at her and blames her for wanting too much. Like Adam, I want to blame my wife for all the chaos in my world. The man said, "It was the woman whom you gave me as a companion who bore the fruit of the tree, and I with I." Genesis 3:12. Blaming her takes the responsibility off me. My silence asks my wife to intervene in the mess of my life. He requires her to seek me out in every interaction. How many times have I asked him, out of pure frustration, this question: "What do you want me to do?" If you gave me an exact list, I could meet your needs and you would be happy. Give me a list. Then I will never fail. I'll know what to do every time. As a man who feels inadequate and incompetent, it is important that I never make mistakes or blame myself. And so men disappear into their jobs, their hobbies, and their sports, the things that matter the least in relationships. Silence or disappearance become our best defense against fear. That's exactly where the problem lies. My silence is a defense against chaos, not an entrance to chaos. When we refuse to enter into the chaos of our lives, we miss a great opportunity. God created man in his image to create, to make a difference, to leave an inheritance. He created men to bring redemption to a tragic world. He created them forts to protect the boundaries of those around him. He created them to admire other people. But every man has felt the touch of tragedy. He was harmed by his father, his mother, his grandparents, his wife, his children, his superiors, his partners. Every man knows too well that this world is dangerous. Know the danger of taking risks, whether in a relationship or at work. Many men are convinced that confusion in relationships and uncertainty about the future can destroy them. That is why they remain silent. However, when men remain silent, they deny the existence and goodness of God. This idea bothers me. I consider myself a person who believes in God. But when I remain silent, I live as an atheist. I bear witness to my belief that chaos is more powerful than God. Speech is the gateway to the relationship. Silence is the guardian. The Hebrew Bible teaches us that words bring us out of silence and connect us with God. And being powerfully present, with our words, is a unique opportunity to bring life to spaces where death reigns. But along with this opportunity comes a terrifying warning: our silence destroys. There is no middle ground. Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz summarizes this idea well. The world is like a book that can be read in any direction. There is the power of creation, of making something out of nothing. And there is the power of destruction, of making nothing out of something. In every moment of my life, I am balanced between creation and destruction. Silence destroys. Speak, create. Although I am a silent man, I want to be a man who speaks, who is present, who, like his God, makes something out of nothing. Conclusion of the first part. You can understand a man when you know the questions that burn inside him. For many, one question stands out as the most important: what should I do? When men feel the deepest agony, this is the question they ask. When man finds himself in a place where that question cannot be answered, he moves to a place where he can find answers. When you look around and realize that you have unintentionally landed yourself in a confusing situation where you need courage and creativity, you find a way to return to the realm of management. He finds a way to do some activity in which his skill and knowledge are useful, in which his inability and fear are not exposed, in which the courage of living in an unpredictable world is not required. In short, he retreats where can. He manages to find an answer to that burning question in his chest. When man flees from the terror of mystery towards the comforts of administration, he commits himself to himself. The man governed by the demand of always knowing what to do cannot experience the profound joys of masculinity. He violated his calling and betrayed his nature. God calls man to speak in the darkness, to remember who God is and what he has revealed about life, and, with this memory occupying the most important place in his mind, to enter into his relationships and responsibilities with the force of the imagination of Christ. God is telling a story. A story full of life, love and grace. A story about hating evil and honoring good. A story rich in drama, poetry and passion. As we see this story told throughout our lives, we gain the courage to handle life's inevitable disaster. We find the strength to move forward, to take risks, to connect deeply, because we are immersed in the broader story of God. God calls us to go beyond the silence of Adam. We must surrender to God with absolute trust in his goodness and, with the freedom created by that trust, enter the depths of dangerous uncertainty with the life-giving word. This type of move can be something as simple as cheering up a child by giving them a little more attention, or something as terrifying as giving your heart where it may not be wanted. But therein lies the difficulty of overcoming Adam's silence. We are afraid. Commitment to virile movement creates a healthy fear. We realize that there is no code that we can follow in the areas we decide to enter. But it also creates a sense of anticipation. When we decide to speak in the dark, God gives us courage, not the kind that calms shaking legs, but the kind that helps us go ahead with them. It's an interesting progression. When men advance by faith, they become more deeply conscious of their need for God, and therefore seek him more zealously. And when we look for it with all our hearts, we find it. That's the promise. Men who spend their lives encountering God quietly transform from mere men into elders, godly men who know what it means to trust someone when there is no plan to follow, Christ-like mentors who speak into that darkness, with strength instead of control, with gentleness rather than destructive force, and with wisdom that cuts through the confusion to the beauty on the other side. The path of authentic masculinity is entered through the narrow door of pure passion and complete surrender to God. The path, beyond the door, is the freedom to speak in the darkness, as one who echoes the voice of a God present, well remembered and forgotten. End of this first part.